Right, now that we've got everybody organised, I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to move the motion in the name of Keith Brown. Mr Ewing, you've got 14 minutes. Can I just remind everybody that time is extremely tight? I have allowed an extra 5 minutes for the topical questions, so that does impinge on this debate. Mr Ewing, you've got 14 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I welcome the opportunity to set out the Scottish Government's position on air passenger duty. We welcome the support of Scotland's 4 main airports for the devolution of air passenger duty. As the Minister for Energy, Enterprise and Tourism, I recently have had the opportunity to meet separately and at length with the Chief Executives of both Edinburgh and Glasgow Airport, and I'm scheduled to have a formal meeting with Derek Provan of Aberdeen Airport in the new year. As the motion makes clear, we have seen the worst recession in living memory, and tourism within Scotland has been impacted. However, the gross value added figures from 2008 onwards have shown an encouraging rise to their current annual figure of £2.9 billion, £2,900 million. We have also seen welcome growth in both domestic and international passenger numbers in the past 12 months. That record of success is hugely appreciated. It is unfortunate, however, that APD has prevented us from being even more successful still. Presiding Officer, this is the context, the global context of 2012 being the year, the first year, when it has been predicted by the United Nations World Tourism Organization that there will be 1 billion tourism arrivals across the globe. For the first time in the history of this planet, 1,000 million people will be able to enjoy a holiday, something that all of us here and our families have probably taken for granted. That figure is expected to grow to 1,800 million by 2030, almost doubling in a relatively short time. And Scotland, for all our manifold attractions, is in competition with the rest of the world for each and every one of those potential customers. Therefore, Presiding Officer, I hope that it can be agreed by all sides on this debate that our competitive stance is a key factor, not just in attracting an increasing share of that burgeoning global market, but also keeping and retaining the business that we have already won and we've worked so hard to achieve. The industry across Scotland, from B&Bs to large hotels and visitor attractions, have worked so hard to win over the years by the quality of the offering that they have provided. And business tourists, for example, have a propensity of 40% to return. Someone that comes to Scotland is likely, to the extent of 40%, to come back to Scotland. So that importance of bringing new people to come to see Scotland for the first time cannot be overstated. Presiding Officer, air passenger duty is a heavy cost to our tourism offering in Scotland. The York Aviation research is clear that APD is the most expensive aviation duty in Europe. The increases in APD rates since 2007, plus those projected through to 2016, are estimated to result in a loss of 2.1 million passengers to Scotland's main airports every year. A stark illustration of the effect of the burden of APD is that APD, together with other burdens such as value-added tax and tax on our fuel and the cost of petrol and diesel, means that the UK as a whole, despite the excellence of our offerings, facilities and infrastructure, is rated by the World Economic Forum as the 134th least competitive country in tourism from a list of 137. Certainly.
The Minister refers to the York report and cites the projected reduction in passenger numbers by 2016 of 2.1 million. Does he blame APD for all of that loss?
Well, first of all, I'm not in the blame game. I mean, I hope we can put party politics aside and recognise that this is a serious issue, and it's one where it would be better if we had control in Scotland. I was encouraged by Michael Moore's remarks when he said that this should be devolved to Scotland. I was encouraged by Charles Kennedy's remarks when he pointed out the damage that he believes that has caused. However, I do hope that cross-party we can recognise that beyond peradventure, APD is playing a significant part in that statistic. So I hope that moves on. Well, all right.
The airport chiefs are quite clear that there's a multitude of factors. They blame APD in part, but a big proportion is the economic impact, the fact that we've had a recession. How can the Minister actually try and split apart what is APD responsible for and what is the economy responsible for? Because it's important to get the evidence right.
Well, I believe the report it makes it clear that APD is playing a very substantial role here, and it goes beyond that, actually, to quantify the impact. And these are projections, and they're one view. No one is saying that there can be perfection about these statistics, but Mr Rennie has asked a question, so let me give you this answer. I've said that the estimate of the loss of passengers because of the increases in APD rates from 2007 to 2016 are estimated to be 2.1 million passengers. Now, that, frankly, it really is a shocking statistic. And the economic loss to tourism is £210 million. We really cannot afford to suffer losses of that order as a result of being singled out in the EU, of having APD rates which are so much higher than in other countries. For example, since Mr Rennie opened the door, I may as well give him some statistical analysis. The rates of aviation tax in other European countries, and these are highly relevant figures because we're competing with these countries for tourists. In Austria, it's €35. Germany, it's 42. Ireland, it's 3. This is for long-haul rate and economy. The UK, it's 113. For maximum rate in any class, Austria 35, Ireland 3, Italy €5, the UK 226. Now, the last time I noticed, the difficulties facing peoples in Europe affected all EU states. I don't understand how it is that other EU states that are facing economic challenges, just as the UK, are able to offer minute levels of APD in comparison with the rates applicable in the UK. I look forward to Mr Rennie's explanation of that matter in his speech, Presiding Officer. In looking at the options for APD, we will, of course, be assessing the carbon emission implications of our proposals in the same way that we will be assessing the financial implications. Well, I'm not sure how much time I've got, Presiding Officer. Oh, well, OK.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful. In September, I asked the Minister in committee whether this work has been done prior to the formulation of the government's policy. Let's look at the evidence before we decide what policy should be. He told me that work to assess the carbon impact hasn't been done, but he opened the door to asking the UK Climate Change Committee to undertake that. The First Minister, the next day in the Chamber, said much the same thing. It is our responsibility to put forward an
Mr.
estimate.
Harvey, interventions have got to be brief.
And we will do so.
Mr. Ewing,
why has
could you
no
answer the
progress
point?
been made?
Well, I'm happy to stand by the First Minister's comments that he made from memory, I think, Presiding Officer, in September. I think it was the 12th of September. And he pointed out to Mr Harvey that we shall be assessing those impacts environmentally as we are economically. He also pointed out, and I think it's something that most of us accept, that the real impact on emissions is from several flights, because the more that aircraft land and take off, the greater proportions of fuel they use. Our policy, our desire is to have fewer flights, more direct flights, less short-hop flights, and by doing so, we will, I hope, manage to please Mr Harvey. There is a high objective, a high ambition, but I hope that he agrees with the point that I made there. Direct flights will make it easier, Presiding Officer, to attract business tourism to our country and to increase our share of that vital market. When airlines are looking to those crucial direct routes, flag carriers in particular, they are keen to look at the economic potential of the linked cities. Now, that's why we should remember that airports whose operations are currently harmed by APD are far more than just places where people shuffle in and out. Airports invest substantially in their amenities for passengers and the surrounding infrastructure for business. They are major employers in an area both directly and indirectly. For example, Glasgow Airport not only employs around 420 staff directly, but adding contractors and service providers, that figure rises to 4,500. And across Scotland, Glasgow Airport estimates that it supports 7,500 jobs. That, Presiding Officer, underscores the importance of Glasgow and all our other airports to the whole economy. We need to recognise, therefore, certainly.
Gavin Brown.
To the Minister for giving way. He spoke a couple of minutes ago about wanting to see fewer flights. If that happened, what would happen to employment and the number of jobs supported by the aviation industry? Minister.
I said that we would rather see more long-haul and direct flights and fewer short flights, not a total diminution in the number of flights. Plainly, well, I hope we all want to see more direct routes to Scotland. I don't know what the Tories' policy is, because Ruth Davidson wants to scrap APD. That's the pledge she made, so I will wait with interest whether that pledge is going to be supported today by the Conservatives in the Scottish Parliament. And if it is, how on earth are they going to obtemper that pledge, since they don't want the power to be passed here, and their colleagues down in the coalition government at Westminster have uttered not a single intention even of cutting the rise, never mind scrapping APD. So I don't think we'll be taking any lessons from the Conservative Party in Scotland on that matter. Presiding Officer, to conclude, the Scottish Government has been clear that the devolution of air passenger duty should take place as soon as possible. The Calman Commission recommended devolution in June 2009. It is extremely frustrating that the UK Government has still not seen fit to act on this. It is interesting and I think significant that the airports in Scotland believe it should be devolved. And I think that they believe that not simply because they know that that is something we support, but because they feel, I hope they feel, that the political mood in Scotland is more conducive to a more sympathetic result for them across parties. I sincerely hope that that will be evident this afternoon. By devolving air passenger duty to Northern Ireland, the UK Government has clearly recognised that a one-size-fits-all policy does not work. It doesn't reflect the inherent differences in the UK aviation sector. It doesn't reflect the challenges facing our airports, the needs of our passengers, nor what Scotland needs to compete on a global stage. Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my colleague Keith Brown's name.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. I now call on Richard Baker to speak to and move amendment number 4874.3. Mr Baker, you have up to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The announcement yesterday of the new services to be operated by Virgin Airlines from Scottish airports to Heathrow was welcome and a timely reminder for this debate of the importance of our airports for Scotland's connectivity between the rest of the UK and the world. And of course, it's a crucial issue for our economy as well. Tourism is a hugely important business of Scotland, and this is reflected in Parliament debating business tourism tomorrow, when we will see the Minister again. And some years ago, the aviation industry was booming and there was keen competition to provide cheap fares. Now, with the world economic downturn, rising fuel costs, and more people deciding to stay at home rather than travel abroad, it's a much tougher time for airlines and for our airports. That's brought the issue of APD levels into sharp relief, and their contribution to making so many of today's journeys by air a great deal more expensive than they were. Because of the lack of direct routes into Scotland, APD is a greater burden for Scottish passengers and for those travelling into Scotland. There are exceptions for the Highland and Island airports, but there's no doubt that in general it's a particular burden on the Scottish economy. This has been made evident in the study commissioned by the Scottish airports on the economic impact of APD, of which the Minister has already spoken. And while the Minister referred to the figures of Scotland as a whole in terms of the effects of high levels of APD, he was right to point to the earlier studies in 2010 commissioned on the general economic impact for individual airports on their areas. And if I can refer to the study for Aberdeen Airport in my region, it showed that Aberdeen Airport supports over 2,000 jobs, and this would rise to 4,000 jobs by 2030 with successful implementation of the airport's master plan. The plan would also enable the airport to contribute over £150 million to the local economy. So the economic potential of airports is clear, and in Aberdeen our airport is of course of fundamental importance too to the oil and gas industry as a key driver of the wider Scottish economy. But if increases in APD continue at their current rate, with the duty having increased by 8% last year, then this will threaten the ability of our airports to make the maximum contribution to growing our economy. No doubt the Treasury is attracted by the current level of APD. It will raise nearly £3 billion, but this will be a false economy if it means we can't grow tourism as we would have hoped, or if it means airports can't recruit the additional employees they clearly hope to. And we should be clear that it's not only in this Parliament these concerns have been expressed over the current level of APD. In Westminster too, a motion was agreed with support from the Labour benches and indeed by members on other benches as well, which expressed concern over the high level of APD and called for an urgent review of its impact on the economy prior to the next budget when it's due to increase again. But of course there is a particular concern over the level of APD here in Scotland because we are particularly disadvantaged due to the lack of direct routes. And what that means is passengers from Scotland are in fact paying APD twice. So a passenger flying from London direct to Orlando from Heathrow, they'll pay APD once. A passenger flying from Aberdeen to London and on to Orlando will have paid APD on both journeys. Now we see that as clearly unfair. It means there's a disproportionate burden on airports and passengers here, and that's why we've called for the UK Government to address this issue as a matter of urgency. And of course it's also the reason for the strong focus there has been on the potential for devolution of APD to which the Minister referred. We too believe there's been an extremely strong case made for the devolution of APD, and we can agree with the vast majority of the Scottish Government's motion. We don't see devolving APD as the only way of properly supporting the ambitions of the aviation industry. I think on that point, Willie Rennie made a good intervention. And there are a range of interventions ministers can take, including marketing Scotland abroad and ensuring ease of access to our airports. Mr Brown.
Keith Brown.
Just if I could clarify that point, because I think the point at the very end of the Labour amendment to take immediate action to resolve the anomaly which he just mentioned is welcome, but he does mention elsewhere having further reviews on the issue of devolving this, and you'll remember that the Labour government said that they did not attach priority to this measure. That was the exact words of their response previously. Can I just have an exact clarification from Richard Baker? Does the Labour Party now, as of this moment, support devolution of APD to Scotland?
Richard Baker.
Indeed, this is a position we established at the Scotland Bill Committee, which has seen many members here in the Chamber, and I don't resolve on one word of the statement made in the Scotland Bill Committee, and that was a cross-party commitment. So I absolutely agree in terms of the issue of devolution, in the case of devolution of APD, and we agree that is of fundamental importance, and that's why the Calman Commission recommended that it was a suitable tax for devolution. And again, as we heard earlier from the Minister, and as I've restated just in my speech then in response to the Minister, the Scotland Bill Committee found exactly the same case, so we are persuaded of the case. And so while we might look for action on this issue sooner from the UK Government, I've no doubt devolution of APD will be an important consideration for all of those looking at future powers for this Parliament, as we are in Scottish Labour through the Devolution Commission. Of course, with devolution of APD would come new responsibilities and new challenges, firstly in funding any reductions in APD and striking that careful balance which is required in supporting our crucial aviation sector in the context of Scottish-wide targets on reducing CO2 emissions. We don't see spiralling APD as an appropriate tool in terms of that agenda, but instead we look to other ways of encouraging the industry to reduce emissions. And of course, the motion refers to the environmental benefits of having more direct routes to and from Scotland and reducing the need for connecting flights. It was to promote just that goal that the Labour and Liberal ministers of the previous Scottish Executive introduced the Route Development Fund. It was unfortunate that this scheme fell foul of EU state aid rules, and it would be welcome if the Scottish Government were able to consider alternative approaches which would be able to support at least some of the objectives which that fund was introduced to make progress towards. And here I think the Conservative motion is right to argue ministers could have done more. We should be ambitious in looking to develop our... briefly, Minister.
Does he accept that action has been taken, such as, for example, the establishment of the Inverness-Amsterdam route, hugely welcomed in the north, was assisted by marketing assistance provided, which didn't reach the EU aid, and therefore positive action has been taken by this government with its partners?
Baker?
We welcome that instance of that action, absolutely, but we believe there could have been a broader effort from the Scottish Government in terms of that, using that approach in other circumstances as well. The importance of the high cost of air travel as a barrier to achieving the goals we want to see for our aviation and tourism industries is reflected in the fact that it's not just our airports that have made a strong case in APD, but also business organisations, including Scottish Chambers of Commerce, the Institute of Directors Scotland, the British Hospitality Association Scotland, and in my own region, Aberdeen and Grampian Chambers of Commerce. So there's a strong coalition of concern over the impact of APD, not just on the aviation industry, but on our wider economy. And indeed, although the motion and the amendments for today's debate suggest we'll not achieve absolute agreement on every point this afternoon, I think the Minister is right to point to a broad consensus on the general concern over APD and indeed the role this Parliament may have in determining these levels in the future. Presiding Officer, we will not be slow in coming forward when we think the Scottish Government are not implementing the right policies to promote growth in our economy. Clearly, in a number of areas, we believe they're not, and we will press the Scottish Government to do more to support our aviation industry. And we certainly believe this government should have done more to improve connectivity to our airports. Ministers should not have cancelled the rail links to Glasgow and Edinburgh airports, and must do much more to improve surface access to Aberdeen Airport. As I said, we also do not believe APD is the only way to address the challenges facing the industry, and devolution of itself does not provide all the answers. There would need to be further debate on what a new level of APD should be. As a Liberal Democrat motion states, it would require an explanation of how it would be funded. But although we believe our amendment reflects the reality of the current debate more closely, while the Scottish Government motion is clearly not word for word what we would have written, and we do think caveats apply, I don't believe these concerns are strong enough to persuade us we should not send out as clear as possible a message from this chamber over the concern over the effect of the current level of APD is having in Scotland and the strong case for devolution. On that basis, and in that context, if our amendment falls, we won't oppose the government motion, and indeed will seriously consider supporting it, because we will make the case when the Scottish Government is wrong, but we believe ministers are right to highlight the urgent need to address the impact of APD on Scottish passengers, on Scottish airports, and on the Scottish economy. I hope the UK Government will listen to the concerns which I believe will be raised across the Chamber in today's debate, and in moving my amendment, Presiding Officer, I hope the Minister will consider supporting our amendment, as we will certainly continue to encourage as broad support as possible for the progress we need on this key issue for our economy.
I now call on Alex Johnson to speak to Move Amendment number 4874.2. Mr Johnson, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I genuinely welcome the opportunity to discuss this important issue for Scotland's economy and for Scotland's aviation industry. In fact, much of what the Minister said in his opening statement, I have to say that I stand close to Fergus Ewing on his desire to see market forces used to ensure that Scotland succeeds in the long term. However, I do question the fact that, given that I was one of the many in this chamber who worried over every clause of the climate change bill and actually thought I was voting for something when I eventually supported it, to see a certain inconsistency in the position the government chooses to take now. However, in his opening statement to Parliament, the Minister rightly praised this report and brought it not at this stage. In his opening statement, the Minister rightly praised this report and used it as an opportunity to bring forward key issues regarding APD. In fact, among the Minister's assertions was, of course, a repetition of the long-held view that direct long-haul flights to and from Scottish airports are somehow more environmentally friendly than the multi-stop journeys via overseas hub airports which are mentioned in the government motion. However, I would suggest that there is some evidence to suggest that the market itself is beginning to give the lie to that assertion. There is now plenty of evidence that economic and environmental efficiency can be achieved by large aircraft flying between major hubs, and that means that in the future more visitors to Scotland rather than fewer may travel via connecting services. This is easily evidenced by the fact that only this week Virgin Atlantic has announced its intention to fly new routes between Aberdeen and Edinburgh to London Heathrow from March of next year. The Minister also told us that, in his opinion, the only way to properly support the ambitions of Scotland's aviation industry and the needs of passenger growth of Scotland's economy is for air passenger duty to be devolved to Scotland. Then he went on to suggest that this should take place as soon as possible, and that he further believes that the UK Government should announce an immediate freeze in APD levels. Well, therein lies the problem. While I admit that even I can see that devolution of air passenger duty may hold superficial attractions, there can be no guarantee that this move would solve the problems which the industry faces. First of all, no thank you. First of all, even if the power to levy this tax was to be transferred to the Scottish Government, there is no guarantee that the rate would not actually be increased for all we know. Of course, the Nationalists will scoff at the suggestion, but that's what they do every time it's suggested that some future Government of Scotland might have to raise a little more revenue. Their habitual claim that in an independent Scotland every tax will be reduced or abolished, while at the same time every budget will be increased, is no more than a case of the Emperor's new clothes. They are now left exposed on a weekly basis. Then there is the simple fact that the reduction or abolition of this tax in Scotland alone could only ever have a marginal effect in comparison to that of reducing or abolishing the tax on a UK-wide basis. Yet this Government are determined to sever the links with Westminster altogether, and by doing so end any influence they might have had in future discussions, cutting off their nose to spite their face. Indeed, Minister.
Well, we've heard a lot of Mr Johnson from why he thinks that we are wrong, but could he explain what the Scottish Conservative policy is on APD, and is it the policy that Ruth Davidson has set out, namely that APD should be scrapped?
Alex Johnson.
It is our objective to benefit the industry by ensuring that passengers to Scotland in future pay as little tax as possible. And that means that this must be dealt with on a UK-wide basis if it is to be effective. In addition to the issues of APD, there is also the vital issue, which many in Scotland will bring to the Minister's attention, of ensuring that capacity in London is maximised or increased. The case for an additional runway at Heathrow has been well made, and it's essential to Scotland's future development that we continue to retain influence in that area of policy also.
Members in his last minute,
the suggestion that there should be an additional runway at Gatwick is one that we might also wish to exert influence on. But finally, there is really only one thing that the Government can think of to help the aviation industry in Scotland? They could always consider bringing back the Route Development Fund, which they themselves abolished in 2007. All very much a case of the pot calling the kettle black, I suspect. In fact, in closing, it could be suggested that if they want advice on route development, they could do a lot worse than consult York Aviation, whose website seems to indicate that that's one of their areas of specialisation. Presiding Officer, I move the amendment in my name.
I now call on Willie Rennie to speak to and move amendment number 4874.4. Mr Rennie, you've got 6 minutes.
I move the amendment in my name so that I don't forget at the end of my contribution. I accept that cutting tax, cutting APD, might lead to economic generation. I accept that. I accept that we might get more benefits to the tourist industry. I accept there might be wider business benefits from doing so. I'm just not convinced, I have to say, by this report. There's a number of inconsistencies in it, and if we're going to make decisions about valuable tax take and about economic growth, we need to base it on solid evidence. And if you look at some of the contradictions, I would say, in the report, I mean, the airport chiefs tell me that one of the reasons for a reduction in passenger numbers is partly the economy, and it's not just APD. Now, what this report doesn't do, it doesn't split out what is responsible for which effect. There was already a reduction of 1.2 million passengers from 2007, when the APD was also increased. But the economy, that was when the recession hit the hardest. So there seems to be an inability to separate the two issues. And if you look at the actual figures as well, from 2010, passenger numbers have increased at a time when APD increased as well. So it's not a simple correlation that if you increase APD, passenger numbers go down. This report, I don't think, necessarily adds to the contribution in this debate, certainly.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much for taking intervention. I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, do you think that the Scottish economy would gain from having lower or zero APD or not?
Willie Rennie.
Of course it would, but it's not a simple equation, is it, like that? Because you have to consider how the money is going to be spent otherwise. I mean, effectively, if you took the figure back to 2007 levels of APD, you're talking about £90 million this year. Not just now. I'll finish this point. Not just now. No, not just now. I'll try and answer Mr Gibson's point. But if you were to take it back to that level, that's £90 million. Now, if you take that forward to 2016, you're getting up to around about £400 million worth of investment. Now, that's £400 million worth of shovel-ready projects. Now, we've heard in this Parliament numerous times demands from the Westminster Government to invest more in shovel-ready projects, but we now have a sudden change in strategy that APD is now the single answer to improving our economy. All I'm saying is we have choices to make, and you can't simply say by cutting APD nothing else happens that's bad. Certainly.
Kevin Stewart.
In your actual amendment, Mr Rennie, you say that the York Aviation report would result in a loss of around £90 million to the Scottish Government. The reality is that the York Aviation report does not say that at all. It says that it would be an annual loss in tourism expenditure, not in tax receipts. So your amendment itself is flawed from the very beginning.
Willie Rennie.
I think that what we've done is we've worked out from the report the effect of taking the APD levels back to 2007. And if Mr Stewart looks at that, he'll find out that we're absolutely correct in this. But actually, if you look at what the motion says, they're not even proposing to go back to 2007 levels. They're only proposing to freeze. Now, if you propose to freeze the level of APD, therefore you're not going to recover the 2.1 million passengers that the motion and the report sets out to try and achieve. So there's an inconsistency there as well. They complain about the 2.1 million passengers, but they're proposing to do very little about it. The actual motion, it would only have an effect of recovering, if the report is to be believed, 300,000 passengers. That's the difference between the two, certainly.
Ferguson.
I mean, we do believe that there should, as a matter of practice, be no further increase in APD as planned. Does Willie Rennie share that view?
Willie Rennie.
And this is why I'm setting this out, because it's really important we understand the effects on passenger numbers. What is causing this reduction? We have to understand that. And that's why it's important that we need to wait for the Treasury report that's considering these matters. That's why we need to understand. Because simply, if you read this report, you would lead to conclusions that are simply not the case. The impact of the economy on passenger numbers is significant. This report ignores that. And the report should consider it because, as the airport chiefs have told me, it is a consideration that is worth making. Now, on a point of consensus, we do believe, not just now.
The member's in his last minute.
On a point of consensus, we do believe the APD should be devolved. We have stated that for some time. I think it would allow us here in Scotland perhaps target more routes to try and improve route development. It would allow us to try and grow long-distance routes, as the Minister has pointed out. So we support him in that objective. The disagreement that we have is somehow by taking APD levels, by freezing them, or even taking them back to 2007 levels, will suddenly have a return of 2.1 million passengers. Because I don't believe that this report has any evidence to support that. And at the end of the day, this is about choices that politicians have to make. We can't simply, on the one hand, say, shovel-ready projects, capital projects are the first and most important thing we must ever do, and then go on to change the strategy the next week just because we want to have another pop at the UK government. Thank you.
Mr Rennie, could you move your amendment?
I did earlier, yeah.
Thank you very much. I now call on Patrick Harvey to speak to and move Amendment 4874.1. 6 minutes, Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's not usually Willie Rennie who sets my colleagues in the Parliamentary Green Office scrabbling for their pens for the buzzword bingo sheet, but his repeated reference to shovel-ready projects will have had them very excited, I have to admit. When this Parliament first agreed in principle that we should be setting long-term, ambitious climate change targets, when we passed the legislation unanimously to put those targets into effect, and when this current Parliament reaffirmed those targets, again unanimously, we did something extremely important. We did something that very few other countries or legislatures or jurisdictions have achieved. That kind of consensus is not being won easily around the world on the issue of climate change. It's a polarising issue in many parts of the world, where industries like the aviation industry and the fossil fuel extraction industries scurry around lobbying against environmentally responsible policy and spreading disinformation. But this Parliament did it. This Parliament achieved consensus from left to right, including Mr Johnson, who spoke earlier about the possible contradiction between the position the government took then and the position it's taking now. Clearly, Mr Johnson is comfortable with that contradiction in his own position, having voted for those targets. Is it really the case that we achieved that world-leading position of unanimity on the climate change targets, and that we're now going to prove ourselves unwilling to take the difficult actions which are necessary actually to achieve those targets? The government, in taking actions on any area of policy, should be looking at the evidence first and then deciding what its position should be. But as my questions to Mr Ewing and Mr Salmond in September showed, they've decided what their policy is, and now they're thinking that possibly they'll look at what the carbon impact might be. The First Minister says it's the Scottish Government's responsibility to come forward with that assessment, and yet the work hasn't been done. We're going to be deciding the policy and then looking for the evidence, a classic example of science abuse in the policy-making process. It's very clear, Deputy Presiding Officer, that relentless aviation growth will lead to relentless emissions growth from the aviation sector. Aviation is an inherently high-carbon mode of transport. That isn't going to change. There may be measures to ameliorate it, measures to slightly reduce it, but it's going to remain an inherently high-carbon transport mode. Demand growth is being facilitated, even stimulated by the government without regard for the climate impact, which should be assessed beforehand.
Stuart Stevenson.
Is the member aware of the experiments, the in-service use of biofuels, which are essentially close to being carbon zero?
Patrick Harvey.
It's possible that small-scale use of locally sourced biofuels can be close to carbon zero, but I think the member knows very well that industrial-scale production of biofuels brings with it a whole host of other environmental problems, as well as not, in fact, being carbon neutral. Simply suggesting the idea that the aviation industry can replace its gargantuan demand for kerosene with a gargantuan demand for industrial-produced biofuels is not environmentally responsible. Now, the other approaches that have been suggested, inclusion of aviation within the emission trading scheme. Well, it's clear to me that the emissions trading scheme is not having the long-term impact on reducing emissions that it was designed to have. We have aviation included in the Scottish targets, but only with a multiplier of 1, despite the fact that we know aviation has a higher impact on climate change than other sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Members have talked about promoting long-haul flights, direct flights, to replace short-haul aviation. Well, if the Air Route Development Fund that the previous executive was so proud of actually had the effect of reducing domestic short-haul aviation, I might have been interested. But it didn't. It didn't reduce those numbers of flights. More long-haul plus short-haul, is still more. More plus more is still more. And we've got to acknowledge that even if that objective of reducing or eliminating short-haul flights was achieved, that's more empty slots at the other end of a short-haul route, and those slots will fill up with additional long-haul routes. I'll take one further intervention.
Kenneth Gibson.
The number of long-haul flights actually from Scotland is diminishing. I mean, this year you could go to Cape Verde from Glasgow, and you could also go to Dominican Republic. You can't actually from next year. But do you not accept at 0.69 tonnes of metric carbon it costs to go from Edinburgh to Beijing, but it's 0.81 from Heathrow. So you're not actually reducing the number of people travelling. You're only making them go through Heathrow. And I know you know this because you've been to Bangkok and Cape Town. And
Patrick Harvey, less than a minute.
And my amendment makes clear that the use of APD or other financial and other methods should be about reducing demand, not simply achieving a short-term change, such as replacing short-haul with long-haul flights. Others have suggested that there is unfairness in APD, that it's unfair to charge people these levels of tax. The reality is a reduction in APD is regressive for many of the same reasons that the Labour Party argues a reduction in the council tax is regressive. It's the wealthiest who fly most, and they would be the ones who save the greatest money. This is a very low-taxed mode of transport compared with every other mode of transport that we have available to us. In moving my amendment, Deputy Presiding Officer, I would like to say that how these powers are exercised are much more important to me than where they are exercised, and they should be exercised in a way that's compatible with the unanimously agreed climate change targets. I move my amendment.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate, and I call Colin Keir to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Like every other business sector, those stakeholders dealing within or in the periphery of the aviation industry fight their corners. Passenger groups look for a better deal from airlines and better airport services. Airlines look for better deals from airports and so on and so on. However, the issue of air passenger duty does the near impossible and has everyone singing from the same hymn sheet. On the 31st of October, I was fortunate to chair the first full meeting of the cross-party group in aviation, in which air passenger duty was the main item of discussion on the agenda. Among those present were airline representatives from British Airways, EasyJet, Virgin Atlantic and Logan Air. Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen airports were represented, as well as others from tourism, chambers of commerce and other business sectors. The main source of information, of course, is the report, which was commissioned on behalf of the Consortium of Scottish Airports by York Aviation, as has been mentioned. And what a damning report I believe this is. As has been mentioned, APD rates have rocketed since 2007, with short-haul flights being penalised to the tune of around 160%, and the report gives what it calls real-world examples. And perhaps this might be a little bit closer to Patrick Harvey's statements. A family of four going on holiday to Spain before APD increases in 2007 would have paid £20. This would have risen in the summer of 2012 to £52. If this isn't bad enough, APD levied on long-haul passengers is leapt between 225 and 360%. Prior to 2007, the APD rate for the same family would have been £80 to fly to Florida. This summer, they would have to pay £260. Now, while I wouldn't expect many complaints from many ex-Etonians, particularly those in Mr Cameron's cabinet, I would expect complaints from those on a fixed salary that have had to save for months to take their family on a holiday. But of course, there is a wider picture, and it harms not only families, but carriers, airports and general business. Edinburgh Airport, in my constituency, will have lost by 2016 around 1 million passengers, thanks to high APD rates. And this is not the only example of Scottish airports suffering, with knock-on effects to Aberdeen, Prestwick and Glasgow. Of course.
Patrick Harvey.
He mentioned Aberdeen. I wonder if he could explain why Aberdeen has reported its busiest October for 5 years. Just in November this month, they've reported passenger sales a year-on-year increase by 11.3%.
Colin Keir.
I don't have that number on me, so I'm afraid I can't give him a definitive answer. However, I'm pretty sure that one of my colleagues could actually answer that. I hope you will take my apology for that. Whichever way you look at it, this is a lost opportunity for economic development in so many ways, and it does beg a belief that George Osborne, Danny Alexander, can't see the revenue as well as possible capital spending benefits of another 1 million passengers to Edinburgh Airport, as well as to the wider economy. I've already given way, please. It's disappointing that the Tories and Liberal Democrats can't accept through their amendments that this is a UK-wide problem. Northern Ireland has APD devolved. Why not Scotland? We're now debating this here today simply because the Westminster Coalition is ignoring pleas for help from the industry. It would be really good to know what lobbying the Tories and Liberals are actually doing in London. And as the Minister has said, competitiveness is the key in the airline industry, particularly affecting low-cost airlines. A high level of air passenger duty could be the difference between profitability, which in turn means the possible loss of a route and, in some cases, jobs. In Europe, many countries, such as the Netherlands, problems of an air tax were found early and only lasted a year when Schiphol Airport passenger numbers showed a significant drop. In Ireland, after an 8% reduction in passenger numbers, the ticket tax cost was dropped from €10 to €3. At the cross-party group meeting, Roddy McPhee of Barhead Travel informed us that he had found that some of his customers had changed their travel habits. Customers, particularly those making international connections, were choosing to fly from Dublin, Schiphol or Frankfurt just to avoid paying the UK's ridiculously high level of APD. I suspect that we in Scotland will be better off in the medium and long term concentrating and encouraging more direct flights where possible, and probably using hubs other than Heathrow, particularly if APD remains high, and other hubs such as Schiphol, Frankfurt, Dubai, Istanbul continue to up their customer improvements. They may be a more attractive hub destination. Scottish passengers shouldn't be financially penalised because of where they live. And it's clear in other ways how APD does influence carriers. The House of Commons All-Party Parliamentary Group for Aviation, from their report of August this year, pointed out that it's a matter of public record that Continental Airlines would have abandoned flights from Belfast to the US if the level of APD was not reduced. Aviation plays a major part in the Scottish economy. Thousands are employed directly and indirectly. Edinburgh is a city which is and will be the driver of the Scottish economy, regardless of the result in 2014. As a country on the edge of Europe, we require the incentives to compete not just on a local but on an international scale, and civil passenger aviation is one of the key industries we need to succeed. Air passenger duty is a major hindrance to improvement and denies travellers from our part of this island and others a fair deal. If Westminster can't fix this, give us the tools, we will do it. I support the motion.
Thank you. I should have said at this stage it's speeches of 6 minutes and it is quite tight. Malcolm Chisholm, to be followed by Brian Adam.
Presiding Officer, I believe the debate today can be divided into two parts. Firstly, whether air passenger duty should be devolved, and secondly, what we should do with such a tax when it is devolved. On the former, I'm quite clear that I, along with all my colleagues on the Labour benches, support the devolution of air transport passenger duty. I welcome the fact that the Calman Commission proposed that and regret that the UK Labour government did not take that proposal on board. To be fair to that government, I think it did have concerns about state aid rules, but with the devolution of air passenger duty to Northern Ireland, I think it is quite clear that there are no European issues and that there is really no obstacle now to the devolution of the tax. And I think the current UK government supports that, and I hope that they will do the right thing as soon as possible. So I look forward to the day when we actually have debates in this Parliament about taxation as well as spending. I hope there will be many taxes that are devolved to this Parliament as part of enhanced devolution, and I think we should start the debate on this particular tax, air passenger duty, today. Now, as it happens, I started this debate in 1994 because I was lucky enough, if that's the right word, to be on the finance bill in 1994, the finance bill which introduced for the first time air passenger duty. So, of course, in preparation for today's debate, I did read the speech that I made then. We had to make rather long speeches in committees in those days in Westminster. But in summary, we were totally opposed to the introduction of this tax, and I think at the time we felt it was one of many tax increases that the government of the time was proposing. And we also predicted quite correctly that although it was starting at a low level, it would increase significantly over time, and so it has happened. But in fact, the main thing that struck me looking back at my speech and others in that debate was that there was no discussion whatsoever about the environment in the context of this tax. And that's perhaps not surprising because we were not very well educated about climate change in those days. But we really have to face up to the environmental dimension of this debate. The reality is we have to reduce our emissions by 80%, but at the same time there is a massive growth in demand for air transport. So it's 5.5% of CO2 emissions currently. It's predicted to be 15% in 2030, and the Department of Transport in London says it will be 21% in 2050. And of course aircraft are also responsible for high altitude emissions of nitrogen oxides and the formation of cirrus clouds and contrails, so that the total climate change effect of all aviation emissions is estimated to be at least 2 to 4 times greater than the effect of the CO2 emissions. So this is a massive contribution to the climate change problem. Aviation is the most polluting form of transport, and it seems to me that we have a fundamental problem with transport policy as a whole, that we always let the economic considerations trample on the environmental. We must look at both, and in any sensible debate about this tax, we have to do that. Now, I accept the environmental arguments are complex. It's not an ideal tax from an environmental point of view, and the Liberal Democrat proposal of taxing planes rather than passengers seemed rather a good one, although I think that ran into some European problems. So yes, we would have to discuss what was the best form of environmental taxation, but surely when we have more tax raising powers in this Parliament, we will recognise that there has to be a shift towards environmental taxation. So yes, this may not be an ideal tax, but I do think we have to look at the consequences of reducing it greatly, not just in terms of the effect it would have on public revenues, but also in terms of the environment. So that has to be there. But of course, I accept many of the economic arguments that the Minister made, although we must always look at economic evidence with some scepticism. The Infrastructure Committee discovered that last year when it was looking at some of the economic arguments for roads expenditure, and Willie Rennie has read the York Aviation Report with a degree of scepticism as well. And I have to say, I did share some of his feelings, and he's dealt with some of those issues. But one thing that struck me was that the York Aviation Report said the amount of revenue from air passenger duty in Scotland this year will be £320 million, and yet I was given a figure of £183 million by Spice, admittedly, I think, for the previous year, but there is a big discrepancy there. So I do have certain question marks about the York Aviation Report. But let's accept that this is complex, that there will be economic advantages. Of course there will be if we can attract more tourists to Scotland, and that's an objective that we would all share. But at the same time, we mustn't overstate these economic consequences, and we've all received a briefing today from Transform Scotland which refers to research by the Aviation Environment Federation, and it doesn't look as if I've got time to read it all out, but I was struck by a quotation by someone who's called Sir Brian Donohoe. It's news to me that my colleague Brian Donohoe was Sir, but he did say, a great supporter of aviation and a great opponent of air passenger duty, he did say, and I quote, "I've not had a single person tell me they are not going on holiday because of air passenger duty." So sometimes we just have to keep these things in perspective. And finally, of course, we have to look at the loss of tax receipts that would result from lowering this tax. Once again, we have an SNP government that wants Scandinavian levels of public service and American levels of tax. Every tax that is proposed for devolution and every tax that they talk about under independence will be reduced. That will have an opportunity cost in economic terms as well as in environmental terms. So this is a complex debate. I support the Labour motion, particularly because it supports the devolution of the tax. But I do think we need a mature debate about this that recognises that it's not a simple but a very complex matter in terms of its environmental and economic aspects.
Thank you. I now call Brian Adam to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I want to point out that Aberdeen Airport is in my constituency. And we've had some interesting contributions so far today. I'm certainly a believer in more direct flights from Scotland, and I don't know if any other members have tried to do something like that, but I certainly have. I've encouraged both the Japanese government and their national carrier to fly direct from Scotland. I don't mind where, but it's important, not just in terms of tourism, but in terms of the great interest in our renewable industry, that they come direct. And there is no doubt at all that direct flights do save on the environmental costs of journeys. We've had views expressed today that this is going to cost us too much environmentally. And I take it that position as a fairly extreme one. But the UK government don't pretend that it is an environmental tax. It is revenue-raising taxes. That's exactly what it is. And it is true to say the Scottish government would have to backfill it. But there are lots of inefficiencies in Westminster where savings could be made. In the Parliament itself, both the capital and revenue, and the House of Lords, and indeed, a range of measures which could be used to backfill it. And it is an important point that you make. I accept that that is the case. But here we have industry who are telling us we need to take control of this tax. How long before they tell us they should be taking control of more taxes? There is no doubt that industry wants us to do that, and not just the partisan business of the aviation industry, but also the Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce is encouraging this to happen. And, obviously it's music to the ears of nationalist business wants us to take control of our own affairs. But they can see the advantage of this. And I hope that at least in terms of air passenger duty, that we can take advantage of that now rather than later. Now, and move towards doing that. The rise in the increase of FPD is a particularly detrimental effect on the Scottish economy. People travel not just for pleasure, important as that is, they travel for business. And it's not just the wealthy who travel. All sorts of people aspire to travel for a variety of reasons. So a tax on this tax and the possibility of it being reduced or abolished on the basis that it is environmentally unfriendly, that it's, an attack on the hydrocarbon industry, or indeed because it is something that will only benefit the wealthy, is absurd. And it does environmentalists no credit whatsoever to be using any of those three arguments to attack the devolution of the tax. I think that there is broad support for the decision on aviation tax being taken by the Scottish Government. This is not the only tax that we should be controlling, but I hope that at the conclusion of this debate we can at least have a consensus on that point. And I think I will draw my remarks to the conclusion at that point and give you a bit more time.
Thank you very much. I now call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Helen Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is no doubt that this afternoon's issue is of importance to the growth and health of Scottish economy. And I have to say, I was a wee bit puzzled by some of Willie Rennie's remarks earlier on, because he talked about the SNP priority being shovel-ready projects and then being APD, as if somehow you couldn't do both at the same time. I'm not really sure of the logic of that. But during these difficult times, I will certainly let you in, but not just yet, Willie. I was expecting you to leap up there, but I will let you in. Just give me a wee minute. And
Full names, please.
No in 30 seconds yet, but I will let you in. Of course I will. During these very difficult times, international connectivity is key to attracting business and investment to Scotland and the success of our tourism industry. However, in recent years, the decision of successive UK governments to raise air passenger duty by such a huge amount has jeopardised Scotland's place as an internationally connected nation and continues to threaten economic growth and the future viability of many routes from Scotland. And indeed, I mentioned a couple earlier on, but there are many routes direct from Scotland which have been lost in recent times. I mean, from Porto, Gambia, Malta, just to name but three others. And this, of course, impacts, as indeed the Minister said, in terms of employment in Scotland. But the recent report on the impact of APD by York Aviation shows the hugely damaging impact this tax has had on passenger numbers, the cost of flights for ordinary people, international connectivity and the knock-on effect to the wider economy. And as the Minister pointed out in his motion, APD rates since 2007 for short haul have increased by around 160% and 360% for long-haul flights. So it's no surprise that many companies are actually reducing the number of flights that they actually have from Scottish airports. And subsequently, APD has become a significantly high proportion of overall fares, from 10% to 26% of the overall cost of domestic flights and 3 to 14% of international flights. And the report makes clear this has seen the cost of flights for family holiday to Spain increase by £32 and £180 for flights to Florida. And worryingly, and this may be where Mr Rennie wants to come in, it's estimated to be a loss of 2.1 million passengers in Scotland's main airports, resulting in £210 million less being spent every year in Scotland by tourists. And of course that impacts on Scottish employment. Mr Rennie.
Willie Rennie.
For allowing me to intervene. The issue here is the return on investment that you make. It's not saying that necessarily you wouldn't get a return on cutting APD. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is you need to consider the best return. And so far, the SNP government, and there's some evidence to support this, that capital is the best way of investment because you get the best return. What's his evidence that APD would give a similar return?
Kenneth Gibson.
Well, analysis has shown that, in actual fact, it would bring another £50 million back into Scottish business tax revenue. So although we would lose money from APD, we would get money because more people would be employed and they would be paying tax, etc. And I'm quite surprised with Mr Rennie and his party, because in their Calman submission they actually supported devolution. And I suppose this is just another U-turn following their cuddling up to the Conservatives. Of course, bizarrely, the UK Government appears unique in its dedication to this regressive tax, versions of which have been reduced or abolished across Europe. And we've already heard about how in the Netherlands it was scrapped after only 1 year, after there was a dramatic 8% downturn in demand at Schiphol. And in Ireland, the original €10 rate was reduced to €3 after declines in passenger numbers at their airports. But in Ayrshire, where I'm an MSP, Prestwick has already lost 14% of its current traffic as a result of APD, according to recent analysis. And one would have thought the UK Government might take similar action to address such concerns here in Scotland. Now, we had very good contributions today, but I have to say I was very disappointed by Alex Johnson's, to be honest, Alex, because I don't think he answered any of the key points. It was a very defensive speech, I felt. And You know, the Tories in their budget last year in the UK did say they were going to review APD in Scotland, and they haven't done it, but they've devolved it to Ireland. And I really do think the Tories need to have a coherent position on this in Scotland, whether it's the Ruth Davison position or the position that you tried to cobble together earlier this afternoon. In an HMRC paper announcing changes to APD, it was stated that the government's policy objective was stimulating and rebalancing the Northern Ireland economy, but they don't seem to be too keen to do this at all. So the government realises that one-size-fits-all doesn't work in terms of APD, and indeed the York report points out that there are significant impacts upon UK airports out of London, where the market is smaller and remains less resilient. So surely, if it can be devolved to Northern Ireland, it can be devolved here, and indeed discussions are going on about devolving it to Wales.
The member's in his last minute. It's up to him.
Unfortunately. But the Scottish Chamber of Commerce have stated that, I quote, Scotland to maintain a competitive position and attract tourism and investment to our nation, the Scottish Government will require a greater variety of policy and fiscal tools at its disposal, and it is very important that this is devolved. With the Ryder Cup and Commonwealth Games coming to Scotland next few years, we have a unique opportunity to showcase ourselves to the world and reap the benefits of that and for many years. But in order to do so, we need to ensure Scotland is open for business, well connected and ready to welcome people from all over. But I'll just touch on one last point in my last 30 seconds. Of course, it's not just APD. We should think a wee bit for a minute about the rip-off to Scottish tourists who are going abroad to common destinations through holiday supplements. The brochure for next year, first choice, Glasgow to Dalaman, £200 a head extra. Thomson, Glasgow to Mallorca, £225, whereas Belfast, £165. Sky Tours, Glasgow to Costa Blanca, £215. Simply Travel, Edinburgh to Corfu, £165. Scots are being ripped off, and not just in APD. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Helen Eady to be followed by George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The case for devolution of airport passenger duty has, in my opinion, if not unanimous, it certainly has widespread support in Scotland, with ministers, Scottish airports, airlines and business leaders all campaigned against the airport duty increases announced by the UK Government in March. The Scottish Labour Party also supports the case for devolving it, and that is why I am happy to support the amendment in the name of Richard Baker. The ability to set airport passenger duty rates for long-haul flights has already been devolved to Northern Ireland. And I say to Alex Ferguson, Alex Johnson, I beg your pardon, Freudian slip, are the Tories saying they will treat Scotland less favourably than Northern Ireland? Why? Any family will tell you don't treat one person in the family different from another. We're a family in the UK, just don't treat us differently. Of the handful of countries that have airport passenger duty, okay.
Alex Johnson.
I don't like to rub it in, but this tax was an invention of Labour and Government, and they are responsible for doubling it in 2007, and which took it to the high levels that we've seen in recent years. Why have you changed your mind now?
Helen Eady.
I think Malcolm Chisholm has actually answered some of those points. People are allowed to change their mind in a democracy. Of the handful of countries that have airport passenger duty, the UK's airport passenger duty is the highest in the world. And the latest increase is twice the rate of inflation, with more increases coming down the line next year. So we have energy increases, transport increases. This government knows no end to the way that it can punish its people in the UK. We know, too, that the Route Development Fund created by Lord Jack McConnell was an excellent initiative in helping passengers from Scotland make direct flights rather than have to travel via the main hubs in the south. It was huge disappointment when the EU state aid rules prevented such a splendid initiative, but perhaps the ministers will have some creative discussions in collaboration with the EU. I feel that almost certain that there must be some way of getting around this when you can actually impress upon them just the difference that it could make to people. The travelling public welcomed the chance to avoid such heavily congested airports and cut their journey time significantly. And I say to you, Alex Johnson, that there is no case made in my mind for the third runway in the south of England. We've had overheating of the economy in the southeast of the UK for far too long. It's time that we had a fairer distribution of the investment that goes across the United Kingdom not just Scotland, the United Kingdom. I like nothing better in the summer when I can fly direct to Eastern Europe. And that's why I disagree with Patrick Harvey about direct flights, because, Patrick, in the winter I must fly using changes at Heathrow, Gatwick or Luton, and that inevitably means an overnight hotel to add to an already more expensive ticket. We saw in the past year or so when Jet2.com introduced a new direct line from Edinburgh to Budapest. And so that is why at every opportunity, whether it is working with the airlines or with other countries, we as parliamentarians should work assiduously with any partners who want to help the airline industry develop better travel opportunities for our constituents. And I have ideas of my own in that regard. George Osborne has been accused by a senior Tory backbencher of making air travel a preserve of the rich by the tax on plane tickets. In a recent debate in the Commons, senior backbench Tories said that this was not the first time that senior ministers, including the Chancellor, have been accused of being out of touch with the problems faced by ordinary families, as well as being embarrassed by the high cost of transport. Further planned rises in the tax before 2016 would mean, as others have said, a family of four paying £500 in tax to fly economy class to Australia. In 2005, they said the same family would have paid £80. From George Osborne's point of view, of course, this is a marvellous tax because it costs nothing to collect, as the airlines must do it for the government, and it is unavoidable. And half the people who pay it are foreigners who don't vote here, and from a government's point of view, it's the best tax that has ever been invented. I say to Alex Ferguson, yes, Minister.
Minister.
Can I very much welcome what I believe to be the sincere support from Helen Eadie for the devolution of this tax, but can I just say that a reference to the Labour motion is perhaps a little bit misguided because it takes out my proposal to devolve this tax now and instead puts in a requirement for two reviews, one to Labour's Devolution Commission and another one, again, to UK Government. We need action on this now. Would she support that?
Helen Eadie.
Minister, I think the bottom line is today we support this devolution of the airport passenger duty. There's no question of that. Most airlines are members of the Emission Trading Carbon Scheme, and so from the perspective of environmental arguments, that is a positive. And I would just continue to ask Alex Johnson, why is he differing from Ruth Davidson? I just simply can't understand that. And so too is the case that says if secure direct flights, if we look at the secure direct flights, then that too will help to reduce the CO2 emissions. And again, I just reiterate the point that I made earlier about the third runway. That just would not help us at all. And we should note the work of Wales, where its National Assembly, it said, should be given the opportunity to scrap APD on long-haul flights from the country. The Silk Commission report was welcomed in Wales, in particular the recommendation to devolve responsibility for long-haul APD to Wales. It said,
you must conclude.
The ability to control long-haul flights is just one tool in the armoury, and so therefore, Presiding Officer, in line with your request, I had much more to say, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I do apologise for the tightness of time. George Adam with 6 minutes to be followed by Kevin Stewart. At that point, we have to reduce the speeches to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like Brian Adam, I have to declare an interest in the fact that Glasgow Airport is actually in Paisley, although ironically not in the Paisley constituency itself, but it's an important part of Paisley and Renfrewshire's economy. And I agree with Brian Adam and others when they say the most important thing is to have more links and direct flights to airports like Glasgow Airport, because I was disappointed myself that Virgin, although they secured the flights, the Heathrow slots for Aberdeen and Edinburgh, they were unable to secure the ones for BMI had for Glasgow, because it was only about 6 months of a difference between BMI actually dropping the flights for that area as well. But for me, air passenger duty is another Westminster tax to attack business in Scotland. Mr Johnson said that APD devolution has superficial appeals but can't see the benefit and why we'd want to use it. Well, for me, coming from an area that has a large airport in its area, it's a major employer, it's about jobs, it's about the economy, and it's about the future of that economy in the area. Within Paisley, working class people effectively try to get jobs within Glasgow Airport, Renfrewshire Council or Chivas Regal. These are the three massive big employers in the area. So for them, anything that involves any of these employers is a major issue. And I would also add that in Renfrewshire itself actually exports a third of all Scotland's exports, and it's a major issue for us in transportation for Renfrewshire and the economy locally as well. But the cross-party group in aviation, ably chaired by Colin Keir, actually we had a discussion on the report that we had from York Aviation. And I have to say I was surprised at the senior level of people that had come over to the meeting themselves, because there was people there that had just flown up from the day from British Airways and various other companies. And the gentleman next to me was from British Airways, and he discussed the fact, and his reason for being there was, you are the only parliament within the United Kingdom that are talking about APD and talking about it seriously and wanting to discuss it with the actual industry. Now, that in itself, well, okay then.
I just wonder if the representatives from the industry were able to give you any advice about how you would make up the lost revenue.
George Adam.
The representative of the industry was actually looking at ways that he could grow his business and make sure that the economies of places like Paisley could actually go further. So that's what he was more interested in. Myself, it was about the future and making sure that we can actually move forward. But as Colin Keir has already mentioned, that before 2007, the York Aviation report said that a family of 4 travelling to Spain in economy class paid £20 APD, and today, or next year, they'll pay £52. Now, for a holiday destination airport like Glasgow, this has huge consequences, and as an airport that's in the business market, it also makes it less competitive. During the discussions that we had at the cross-party group, there was also one of the members from the tourist industry actually said that there were some companies putting flights through Ireland, Northern Ireland, because it was actually a lot cheaper for them and they could do that better and be beneficial for the people themselves. Now, this has to have worrying consequences for us here in Scotland, the fact that other people within the industry are doing these type of things. But one of the other major problems that we have, and it affects Glasgow Airport again, is it affects low-cost airlines more because their business model is affected by APD by a greater proportion of the fare cost. So again, Glasgow Airport suffers at the hands of Westminster because EasyJet, being one of the major airlines within Glasgow and a major part of Glasgow Airport's business, they recently sponsored the Rocco Awards in Renfrewshire, which was the Chamber of Commerce Awards, and they want to be involved in the local economy. And they were also a member that turned up at the cross-party group in aviation. So I think we have to ensure that we make sure that we don't get to a situation where companies like that are struggling. But that doesn't stop Westminster. Oh no, Scotland suffers and they continue to do it. And tourism in Scotland, despite Westminster's continued disregard for Scottish tourism, it continues to grow. And it's an important sector for Scotland, and one we must build on. Tourism actually employs 200,000 people and from 15,000 businesses. And Scotland took around 22.3% of total tourism spend in 2011, with only 8.4% of the population. I think we have to ensure that we do have a country, when we're going out and selling Scotland abroad, that we have to make sure that we make it easier for companies to come in and actually the people to come here and see us, because obviously the challenges, economic challenges that there are all over the world, is not just for Scotland here. But Mr Baker and Mr Rennie have said APD in its own is not the be-all and end-all, and I have to say I agree with that, because for me it's about the full economic levers of power, and it's a basket of solutions for us. You know, the devolution of long-haul APD to Northern Ireland shows that what can be done with increased financial responsibility. What could we do with more powers? You know, as Brian Adam quite rightly said, are we going to have business leaders coming to this Parliament and demanding that we have full powers, economic powers in Scotland? That's not such a daft idea as it sounds, because they keep asking for more all the time as they see the Scottish Government is actually looking forward to business. In closing, PO, our airports are an important part of Scotland's economy, not only as gateways to other destinations, but as employers and working within the communities to ensure they give something back. We need the extra powers of APD for the Scottish Parliament because we need the powers to ensure that the aviation industry in Scotland thrives. We have another example. We have here another example of Scotland's Parliament needing the full economic levers to support our own economy, not some Chancellor in Westminster who has no interest in investing in Scotland.
Thank you very much. Can I remind members to avoid using nicknames in the chamber? At this stage of the debate, as notified, speeches are 5 minutes. Kevin Stewart to be followed by Hanzala Malik.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I will stick to the 5 minutes because many colleagues have gone over ground which I was going to go over, and there are some folk who are much more expert in some of these issues than I am, including my colleague Brian Adam, who has had a close working relationship with Aberdeen Airport over many a year, and Mark MacDonald, who was in the Aberdeen Airport Consultative Committee. But I had the great pleasure of having Derek Provan, the Managing Director of Aberdeen Airport, on the board of Nestrans when I was the Chair. He is a man who is always worth listening to, and he always bases everything he says on fact. And of the York report, he said, "This report shows quite simply that APD is damaging Scotland. It is damaging our economy, our tourism potential and our ability as a nation to bounce back from the recession. It limits our opportunities for growth in the employment market, costing as much as £50 million in the process. At Aberdeen Airport, we run a real risk of losing around 200,000 passengers by 2016 through this damaging tax. Each recent increase in APD has a dramatic impact upon what we as airports have achieved and could have achieved without APD. It is imperative that the UK Government undertake a detailed and comprehensive review into APD with the utmost urgency and at the very least freeze APD while that is taking place." Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce have said, "We would welcome APD devolution if it enabled a reduction in costs for businesses in the region, which I believe it can. Devolution of APD would allow the Scottish Government to work more closely with Scottish airports to devise a Scotland-focused package aimed at boosting international routes, while at the same time securing the continuation of lifeline routes." The views of some of the people of the north-east of Scotland. In day-to-day life in the north-east of Scotland, I'm sure MSPs from the region hear about the difficulties that some folks experience in trying to get to certain places. And they are very much of the opinion that we need much more direct routes from Scotland to the rest of the world. I think that is absolutely vital to ensure that the economy, the powerhouse economy of the north-east of Scotland continues to thrive. And what I'm not arguing here and now is that every one of those direct international routes should be from Aberdeen Airport. I'm quite happy to share with Glasgow and Edinburgh, because what we find is that folk are willing to take the train to leave from Glasgow or Edinburgh or even Prestwick to get to their destination. But if they cannot do it from these airports, then it is a flight to a hub airport and then onwards to their destination. And as has been pointed out by my colleague Kenneth Gibson earlier, we know for a fact that that increases the carbon footprint dramatically. Now, I have to say that in terms of the proposals that we've already seen through Calman, the Silk Commission, which reported the other day, says that APD should be devolved to Wales. I don't think that there is any argument out there that says that it shouldn't. We know now that Northern Ireland in January 2013 will reduce the duty on long-haul flights from there to zero. Now, Presiding Officer, what I can see is a situation where a number of international carriers will move to Belfast. And what we will see from Scotland is the number of flights, short-haul flights, increasing from Scotland to Belfast to take advantage of those new routes. I do not want that to happen. I have got absolutely no problem whatsoever with the people of the north of Ireland. Not at all. I want to see their economy thrive too. But I want to see us have the economic advantages that we should actually have. And that is why I believe that it is absolutely vital that we take control over this tax as soon as we possibly can, and hopefully all of the other taxes will follow with the full powers of an independent Parliament. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Hanzala Malik to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Good afternoon, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to have the opportunity to take part in this debate, particularly since I have been campaigning for the direct flights by PIA International Airlines between Glasgow and Lahore, our two twin cities. Air passenger duty for this route would be £65 economy passenger, an increase of over 8% in the last year. I am convinced that there is sufficient demand for the Glasgow to Lahore route, and there is certainly space capability at Glasgow Airport. But the recent high inflation increases on the already high aviation taxation makes it hard to encourage airlines to invest in Scotland. I believe it is important that we take steps to address this issue. The Scottish Air Route Development Fund was one of the great success stories of the last Labour-led administration in the Scottish Parliament. An independent study in 2009 by the transport consultancy Scott Murray put the total net economy benefits to Scotland of the Scottish Air Route Development Fund at over 450 million over a 10-year period, including nearly 35 million of benefits from the setting up of the Glasgow to Dubai link. There are real benefits. The fund grew tourism, sustained businesses, and created jobs. So it is very disappointing that the first act of the incoming government in 2007 was to scrap the Scottish Air Route Development Fund. However, I believe the government could do more to overcome these obstacles. This government has the power. This government has been in power for the last 5 years, and there is still little sign of any progress in this direction. Surely there are ways to meet the Commission's concerns that the Scottish Government and, of course, the Scottish Labour Party proposed an air route marketing fund, which I would be delighted if the Government took up as an idea. Glasgow Chamber of Commerce top priority for air is not passenger duty, but route development activity. It argues that an increase both in number of direction of flights and access to major air hubs, Glasgow needs international promotion. That in turn would grow both inward and outward travel markets. I agree with Glasgow Chamber of Commerce that air passenger duty is only one part of the jigsaw, and say again the Scottish Government to engage positively with the European Commission to bring forward proposals to develop more direct air routes from Scotland, particularly to developing markets. But it's not only just about our links. We also need an infrastructure. And our Glasgow to Glasgow Airport rail link was one which I promoted during my term in Glasgow City Council. I think it is absolutely critical that if we are to become a successful partner in the world economy stage, we need a proper infrastructure which supports our airports and air links. That in turn will increase our productivity, it will increase employment opportunities and, more importantly, business opportunities. We need to encourage businesses to look at Scotland as a destination. It's very good for us to say we're open for business, but we need to have the tools for people to come in and do that business. I recall one particular incident where an Australian businessman came to Scotland to develop and make a hotel in Glasgow, and the first thing he complained about was the transport from the airport to the city. And that disappointed me because I went to a lot of trouble to try and encourage this businessman to come and develop and take a project up in Glasgow. For him to open his remarks by not, "How are you, Mr. Malik?" but "That's a terrible situation you've got here. You can't even get to the city from the airport." I did remark to myself, well, there are quite a few ways of getting here, but nevertheless, the point was made. And that's always remained in my mind, back of my mind, that these issues are important. The infrastructure for Scotland are important, our air links are important, and the duty that is being proposed and the increased levels that are being proposed are very unrealistic. We already are isolated in terms of rest of Europe. We need to be able to control the cost of people coming and going from Scotland. And one of the biggest ways, the biggest challenges for us, is that the Aviation Authority needs to have a free hand in competing fairly and reasonably across Europe. And therefore, I suggest, Minister, that you bring forward some proposals in terms of how you will address this issue in the European Union to try and assist us overcome these difficulties. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It is just over a year since Northern Ireland gained devolved control over aspects of air passenger duty, no longer subject to Westminster's hikes. Incidentally, listening to Hanzala Malik, of course, it perfectly illustrated one of the irrationalities of the scheme. Flights to Lahore will be in Band B of APD, but flights to India are Band C. So perhaps Lahore could be a hub. Provided you stop for 24 hours in Lahore, you don't have to pay APD on the duty to India. Just one of the many irrationalities that there are in the scheme. We've seen that Glasgow, Aberdeen and Edinburgh described APD as a significant barrier and an increasing burden, and they would welcome devolution. Alec Neil, Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure and Capital Investment, stated APD was a contributory factor in the demise of Prestwick Airport's link with Stansted. We are definitely suffering indeed. Lower air passenger duties can correlate with benefit to the environment. Not only direct flights give us more efficient travel, less hassle, increased tourism, but also reduce the environmental impact. But let me, given that environment is featured in this debate, talk about some of the positive things that devolution of full APD powers could do for us. First of all, we could reduce APD for flights that are towed out from the terminal to the departure point. That requires some capital investment, but would reduce fuel for short-haul flights by between 5 and 10%. Let's see reduced APD for turboprop flights. Now, if you think that's a bit irrational, the shortest scheduled service between Scotland and London happens to be a turboprop flight. On short flights, there is no time disadvantage. That saves between 25 and 40% fuel, and because the turboprops fly at lower, I really won't have time, fly at a lower level, the radiative forcing is reduced. Let's reduce APD for flights that burn low sulphur kerosene. At the moment, marine and aviation are the only people using fuels that are still 3% sulphur. In our cars, we're now down to 0.5% sulphur. That would reduce SO2 emissions and have significant environmental impact. We had a little bit about biofuels. Well, we will move to a position where we'll be able to use hydrogen, a fuel which can be produced 100% from renewable energy, more or less eliminating the CO2 from aviation in the longer term. Wouldn't it be good through APD to be able to start to encourage aviation operators that move in that direction via biofuels? Should we use some of the receipts of APD to invest in longer runways? Longer runways mean that you need less power to take off, you need less power on approach to land, which are the very significant parts of a flight. One of the reasons that Aberdeen's figures have gone up is because the runway has been extended by around 100 metres. For example, the flights from Aberdeen to Baku by Azerbaijan Airlines now, instead of previously could only take 40 passengers, can now fill the plane because the runway has been lengthened. Let's look at the advantages that environmentally there would be if we're able, instead of the Edinburgh-Manchester rail line, transporting people from Edinburgh to Manchester to fly, is instead transporting people from Manchester to Edinburgh fly, because there's a competitive advantage from lower APD. And if there's more choice at Edinburgh, people will travel more directly, and that will be helping. Let's look, if we had the full powers of an independent country, about the routing of our aircraft. We're congested in central Scotland. We have a one-way system in Edinburgh and Glasgow airports that mean aircraft have to travel west across towards Prestwick and then down to Dean's Cross in the Lake District on the way out. We could look at that. Let's look at allowing single-engined instrument flights, as the whole of Scandinavia does. That reduces emissions. Let's look at whether we could have precision GPS approaches, which reduce the approach time, reduce flying time. So many things we could do with APD, so many things we could do with the normal powers of an independent country.
Thank you very much. I now call on Annabel Ewing to be followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be called to speak in this debate this afternoon. As we have heard during the course of the debate, short-haul rates of APD have increased by around 160% since 2007, with long-haul rates having increased spectacularly by up to some 360% over the same period. And as we have also heard this afternoon, the estimates that have been much quoted, which suggest that such exorbitant rises in APD are having a particularly detrimental effect on the Scottish economy, with a significant loss of passengers and therefore drop in visitor spend. And it's astonishing to see that it is estimated that in 2007 alone, some 1.2 million visits were passengers appear to have been lost, and the forecast is particularly gloomy, with a forecast of an expectation of some 2.1 million passengers year by 2016 to be lost, with a consequential drop in spend in Scotland of 210 million per year also by 2016. And I would submit, Presiding Officer, that is simply not acceptable, in particular for our excellent tourism industry, which, of course, despite the very difficult financial climate that we face, saw further growth last year of around 9%. I'm happy to give her.
Alison Johnson.
Has the member considered perhaps the loss of income from Scottish tourists travelling abroad and the resulting impact on the health of the domestic tourism industry? Certainly a study by the University of Oxford's climate change grouping in 2006 found that for every £1 spent by an overseas resident in the UK, a UK resident visiting overseas would spend £2.32. Has any research been done into the fact that there may be a negative effect on the tourism industry in this country?
I thank the member for intervention. As to any studies that have been done, perhaps might be better posed to the Scottish Government or to SPICE. But in terms of the fundamental thesis of her point, I'm not in the business of preventing Scots from travelling abroad, and I very much welcome visits to Scotland. And I think if we see both together, we will see a growth in our tourism sector. But I would ask why it is necessary for us here in Scotland to be subject to the most expensive aviation duty in Europe, and how does that possibly help our tourism industry? And of course, it has to be borne in mind, as the Minister Fergus Ewing, who also happens to be my brother, I'll just make that point now, but as he rightly said in his opening statement, and that's perhaps the odd time that I'll say that, but other countries in Europe, of course, are facing similar difficult challenges at this time in terms of the financial outlook, but they nonetheless manage to operate with a much less onerous aviation duty regime. So surely, at the very minimum, what we should see now is a halt on the part of the UK Government in London to any further increases, in order to provide some respite to the sector and to passengers and to businesses. But would it not indeed be entirely more preferable in the longer term, Presiding Officer, for this Parliament to take decisions on APD, just as we have heard. Northern Ireland can now take decisions with respect at least to APD on long-haul flights, further to that power having been devolved by the UK Chancellor in London in the 2012 budget. And, of course, as Kevin Stewart rightly said, what we see is the Northern Ireland Executive having seized that opportunity to take the decision to reduce such APD on long-haul flights to zero, and that from January next year. And imagine what a boon that would be, Presiding Officer, for the tourism sector here in Scotland if we too could take such a decision. As we have heard this afternoon, the devolution of APD to this Parliament is supported really across the sector. Kenneth Gibson quoted from the Scottish Chamber of Commerce. We also have the Scottish Council for Development and Industry, which supports devolution of APD. We have the support of Scotland's major airports. The Calman Commission supported it. The Liberal Democrats Home Rule Commission supported it. Of course, the problem with these commissions is that they support it, but not, it seems, now. They don't want it to happen now, but they do indicate some support at least. So, Presiding Officer, I'm happy to have had the opportunity to support the Government's motion today in this debate, and the sooner we have control over APD, the better, and of course that holds true for all the other economic levers of a normal, independent country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Mary Fee to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate, and like my colleagues on the Labour benches, I agree that air passenger duty should be devolved to this Parliament, as it has been devolved to Stormont. And whilst agreeing with much of the Government's motion today that the duty has increased since 2007 under both the Labour and the Tories, and the impact that this has had on families, I was concerned that no mention of climate change was made in the Government's motion, and wonder if that may have anything to do with them failing to meet their widely heralded climate change targets. I agree there should be a freeze on the duty while it's reviewed and hopefully devolved, and I am interested in how that level of APD would be determined, and if the SNP government would lower the rate, which would conflict with their climate change targets. Presiding Officer, as the Labour amendment, which I am glad to support, points out, Scots using hubs like Heathrow currently pay APD duty twice. This is unfair on Scots who are hard-pressed to afford family holidays, and backs up what the amendment also says, that the Scottish Government should be working with airports and airlines to explore further incentives and create new routes that remove the need to go to Heathrow in the first place. And representing the rest of Scotland, my constituents are not short of airport choices. However, in some cases, they are left with no choice but to use Heathrow or Manchester Airport because of the limited long-haul flights which are available from Glasgow and Prestwick, and also Edinburgh, which is easily accessible from my constituency. And on the subject of Glasgow Airport, I am disappointed that the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure refused to reassess the TIF project, which would have created around 3,000 jobs and increased the renewable energy manufacturing sector at the airport and across Renfrewshire. The refusal to look at the Glasgow Airport project is another blow to the local economy that has already had the promise of renewable. Very briefly, yes.
George Adam.
Is the member perhaps aware that the same businesses and groups of individuals met with the Deputy First Minister with regards to looking at other ways that we can take business forward in the area?
I thank Mr Adam for that intervention. However, I am disappointed. This was a considerable number of jobs that would have come to my area and would have meant huge economic benefits for the area. And the loss of the jobs from Doosan, which had been much heralded in this Parliament by the First Minister, were lost. Again, another huge economic blow to my area. And once again, this does go against the Government's plans to create a greener Scotland. And, Presiding Officer, only last week, Glasgow Airport announced that passenger numbers had increased by 4.6% for October, compared with the same period in 2011. And that increase is due in part, as acknowledged by the airport, to football fans travelling abroad. But it also shows that APD is not a deterrent for people flying. Overall passenger numbers have increased every quarter in recent years. So we have to be careful when calling for the duty to be lowered or criticising the current levels when the current rate does not discourage flying. While some use the stats from the report on the increases since 2007 to their own advantage, the restructure of the duty in 2007 has to be welcomed, as it recognised the differences in the length of flights and the impact these have on the environment. And what is needed is a greater balance, a balance between aviation taxation that limits CO2 emissions and inward investment and tourism. And given that Scotland and its economy are often relying on tourism, we need to get the levels right that encourage people to come to Scotland, but possibly also encourage Scots to holiday at home. That said, we must also remember that airports are a massive employer in Scotland, as highlighted in the York Aviation Report. Hence the need for a balance that must be addressed in any business impact assessment on the future of APD. And finally, Presiding Officer, there does appear to be general consensus in these motions amendments and the Chamber that APD should be devolved. This would be another step in strengthening devolution and the tax powers this Parliament has. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now calling Mark MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. As mentioned by my colleague Kevin Stewart, I served as a member of the Aberdeen Airport Consultative Committee as I represented the Dyce Bucksburn Daneston ward in Aberdeen City Council, which is where Aberdeen Airport is located. The report by York Aviation outlines the impact of air passenger duty rises and indeed sets out quite clearly the distinction between the impact on short-haul travel and also on long-haul travel, and that's important when looking at the context of short-haul flights versus direct flights that has been raised during the course of this debate. It also focuses in on the impact on individual airports. Aberdeen Airport, which is in my region, sustains the third largest loss of passengers at around 200,000 per annum by 2016. I heard Patrick Harvey talking about the busiest October on record, and undoubtedly there will be individual months where specific events taking place within the North East will encourage greater throughput of passengers, but it's worth looking at it as an overall picture and an overall picture going forward. Indeed, we have the briefing that was provided by Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce, which said air travel is particularly crucial to this part of Scotland because we are so geographically distant from London and from Europe's key cities. And when you are, as Aberdeen is, an extremely important part of both the UK and the Scottish economies and also the European economy, it's important that you have some form of quick and ready available links in order to maintain that competitive edge. It's also worth noting that since January this year, aviation has been included in the European Emission Trading Scheme, and that will play its own part in terms of the climate change agenda. And indeed, it's also worth commenting that one of the reasons about using APD is that you encourage planes to be filled up, where at the moment perhaps that's not happening. And indeed WWF are looking at encouraging airlines to fill planes but also to use more efficient aircraft, a point which my colleague Stuart Stevenson highlighted, looking at ways in which you incentivise more environmentally friendly forms of air travel and perhaps use levers of a taxation in order to encourage that. And I think the important point to make here as well, because we've heard the old refrain that this is just a tax that you want to cut. Well, the point about this, obviously, to remember is that air passenger duty is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a progressive form of taxation. Regardless of one's income level, one pays the same air passenger duty. All it does is put pressure on those on lower and middle incomes who may choose, as is their right to do so, to use aviation as a means of transportation. Now, it may be that some in the Chamber want to see air travel once again become the preserve of the wealthy, and that's fine if that is their position, but they should at least be honest in their intentions in that regard. But I would suggest that, firstly, I don't think it behoves any of us to exclude large numbers of Scottish society from being able to access air travel for whatever reason that they may need to use it, whether that be for business or indeed for pleasure. And I take the point that Alison Johnson raised about the comparative spend analysis, and I'm a great fan of the staycation, and I would encourage people who live in Scotland to holiday in Scotland, and I would always do that. But at the same time, we have to respect that people will want to choose on occasion to holiday overseas, and we should not be putting unnecessary impediments in the way of people making that choice. What we should be doing is looking at ways in which we can incentivise environmentally conscious and environmentally friendly means of transportation within the aviation industry. I will always be willing to talk to members and discuss with members ways in which we can operate on the process of incentivisation. But where I absolutely disagree is that we should somehow hit people with sticks and expect them to therefore modify their behaviour on that basis. That doesn't encourage behaviour modification in a positive manner. All it does is make people resent the behaviour changes that they are being faced with. It's also worth noting that, as well as air passenger duty, VAT is also levied on top of air passenger duty. The notion of levying a tax on a tax is a uniquely UK government perspective, and I think it's something that bears witness in terms of what we are discussing today. I believe that devolution of air passenger duty to this Parliament is essential. I also believe that whatever decisions one takes, and Alec Johnson says we have no guarantees that it would not rise. Well, the government has set out its policy position. Other parties can set out their policy position in relation to air passenger duty. But at the end of the day, the key point would be that we would be in a position to decide air passenger duty based on the needs of Scotland, and that's the underlying principle.
Many thanks. We now move to the wind-up speeches, and I call on Patrick Harvey to be followed by Willie Rennie. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Malcolm Chisholm correctly separated out two issues. One is about whether this tax or duty should be devolved. The other is about what to do with that power, and those are separate questions. So I'd like to reassure Brian Adam, who argued that it was absurd for environmentalists to raise a climate change argument against the devolution of this tax, that that's not what I did. What I did is use a climate change argument against relentless aviation growth. And I would say it would be absurd for an environmentalist not to make such an argument. In fact, I say it's absurd for any member who voted for the 2050 climate change targets not to make such an argument. Whether we leave this power in the hands of a UK government that wishes to see relentless aviation growth or a Scottish government that wishes to see relentless aviation growth, I will still argue for a different aviation policy. I give way to Mr Malik.
Hanzala Malik.
Thank you very much. I just want to draw your attention to the reality in life. And the reality in life is when people travel, particularly overseas in long hauls, they have to go via routes within the United Kingdom, which means additional air flights, which contributes more to the pollution. So therefore, I think that when we encourage flights to come from Scotland, we are actually helping to reduce that.
And Mr Johnson articulated the ambiguity of that environmental argument in his opening speech. I've also been quite astonished by the number of members who don't seem to understand that there are such things as trains to London or to Manchester, allowing people to change to a plane. Kenny Gibson, earlier in the debate, had a wee bit of fun at my expense. Very much like him, like his style. Had a bit of fun pointing out that, yes, I have on occasion used a plane. And to be sure, Deputy Presiding Officer, if I was standing here arguing for the mothballing of the aviation industry and digging up the runways for cabbages, I would be a hypocrite in making such an argument. I don't argue that we have to abolish aviation. I argue that we have to use it less than we do now, not see relentless growth. Like Mr Gibson, if you don't mind, I'd like to deal with Mr Gibson's point. Like Mr Gibson, I have taken a decision that issues like international development are a legitimate use of aviation. And so I did take part in conferences, just as he did in Mexico at the World AIDS Conference, and I very much supported his decision to attend that, funded, I think, by the same organisation. But when I've been able to make a choice, for example, to Copenhagen or to The Hague, I've gone by train, an entirely achievable thing to do on a continent like this. When I went to the United States, I thought long and hard about those choices, and I made a decision that I would compromise, and I flew one way and spent 11 days and a great deal of my own money coming back by cargo ship. Now, I know that not everyone's going to be in a position to make those choices, but what we have to do as a society is consider where aviation is the necessary choice and where it can be replaced with an alternative.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Unfortunately, I wouldn't have the choice of some of the choices that Mr Harvey has made. But going back to your points, surely you find it a little bit bizarre that under the current UK system, we've seen the rates, APD rates for short-haul travel rise by 160%, but for long-haul, 225 to 360%. Now, you obviously have used long haul and see that as being more environmentally friendly. Why would you let the UK government allow that situation to happen? And why would you not encourage more long haul flights from Scotland?
Well, that's certainly not the argument that I've put forward, and my amendment doesn't endorse the specific formulation of APD. It talks about how it should be used to restrain growth. Deputy Presiding Officer, we've heard a little from my colleague Alison Johnson about the tourism deficit, and the government's own figures, calculated in 2005, showed a deficit of some 17 billion across the UK, the difference between the amount that incoming tourists spend here and outgoing tourists spend when they go on holiday. And the vast majority, actually, of the money that's spent in the Scottish tourism industry comes from domestic tourism. We should be seeking to grow that. I'd like to also mention the argument that the aviation industry is suffering these incredibly high taxes. Aviation actually receives a vast tax discount from the current regime. It's the only mode of transport that doesn't pay fuel duty. It doesn't, in fact, pay VAT on the full cost of tickets. The tax discounts that aviation industry is currently enjoying amount to more than £10 billion a year, compared with other transport modes. I'm afraid I don't have time to give way to Mr MacDonald. In closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, I'd like to mention one statistic or two that haven't been raised. The concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the main greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, has continued to increase from a pre-industrial level of 278 parts per million to over 391 parts per million in 2012. A concentration that's higher than at any time in the last 15 million years. And astonishingly, some members seem to appear to think that the next quarter's GDP figures are more important than that kind of statistic. Presiding Officer, anyone who voted for the 2050 climate change targets, who is remotely interested in handing on an economy that is viable, let alone flourishing and successful, to the parliamentarians who will take their seats in this place in 2050, must focus on that long-term challenge to the viability of human civilization, and sacrificing that for short-term economic gain is worth nothing in the long run.
Many thanks. And I call on Willie Rennie to be followed by Gavin Brown. 6 minutes, please.
At moments, this debate has been like a parliamentary edition of the holiday programme on the BBC. We've had Helen Eadie telling us about her trips to Eastern Europe. Perhaps she could maybe enlighten us a bit more in the future. Kenny Gibson and all the flights he's been dreaming about, including to Cuba, I suspect. But there's been, I think, quite a useful debate. However, I think it's only looked at one part of the equation. Whenever we're making choices in this Parliament, we need to consider everything in the round, including what Patrick Harvey passionately described in terms of the climate change targets. And we need to consider that because we sit here and we make bold claims about our climate change legislation. But do we follow it through when it comes to decisions on individual projects and individual spending areas like this? And I think we fall short on many of those occasions. So I share Patrick's passion. I don't always agree with the extreme measures that he might take, but I certainly believe that climate change is such a serious issue. We need to consider this in this debate. And actually, if you look at the substance of this motion, it is actually rather timid and cowardly. It looks at the 2.1 million it claims that have been lost, passenger numbers, but actually only proposes remedy for 300,000 by freezing. And at no point during the debate has any single member, in response to me or anybody else in the chamber, spelt out how they'll pay for this. Because I've already said, If you freeze it, £90 million a year. That's the cost. Where does that come from? That's what we need to consider. And secondly, if we're going to go further, and some have suggested this, including Kevin Stewart and Annabel Ewing, that we actually take APD for long-haul flights down to zero, that will be an additional cost in order to compete with, as they say, in Northern Ireland. So not just now. We need to consider these things in the round. You cannot simply take one half of the equation, proclaim the benefits of that half of the equation, and then not live up to our responsibilities in this Parliament to spell out how we're going to pay for that. Many have talked about devolution and have called for devolution, and I share that. I support the devolution of APD, because I think it would allow us, in the way that Stuart Stevenson actually thought, in a very informative way, spelt out some of the things that we could actually try to do, practical measures that we could take, and we could have a much more precise APD scheme that would cover Scotland's special needs. So I think his contribution to the debate was very, very good. I think, however, Kenny Gibson must have been dreaming. I did actually say during my contribution that we were in favour of the devolution of it. But Brian Adam went on to describe about the powers that we need in this Parliament to make the decisions ourselves. But when this government has been given the opportunity to do something about flights to the islands with the ADS scheme, they have failed and failed miserably. They need to think again. If they're going to get these powers, they need to think about properly using them, rather than just using this as a tool, not just now, using this as a tool to make the case for independence. And that's where we need to consider this on its own merits, not in the wider debate. There is also the consideration that we need to make in terms of the environment. And those members, I don't think I've heard one single member, apart from Stuart Stevenson from the SNP benches, refer to the environment in their contribution. I apologise if I have omitted. But several members actually put forward a motion in 2007, including Sandra White, Michael Matheson, Joe Fitzpatrick, Jamie Hepburn, Stuart McMillan and Bob Doris, where they talked about tackling aircraft emissions and supporting air passenger duty. Now, I don't know if those members have changed their mind now, and whether they regret the decision they took in the initial stages, or whether they find it difficult to live up to the consequences of the things that they claimed they supported in this Parliament. And that is the central part of this. We need to consider everything in the round. Of course, the Treasury should be looking at this. Certainly.
Helen Eady.
It really is a nonsense to suggest that there were not a number of members in this chamber this afternoon who actually spoke about environmental issues. The very fact that we spoke about cutting down the number of journeys to Heathrow or to Gatwick or to Luton is a clear indication that we were concerned about the environment. And I could go on, but I won't. I'll take up your time.
Willie Rennie.
I always feel suitably chided by Helen Eady when she stands up, and of course she is right. She referred to those issues, and I apologise profusely for making that claim about Helen Eady. But actually the emphasis from many contributions was actually about passenger numbers and about increasing flights. It wasn't about the environment. The focus was in the wrong place. Now, that's not to say that we should not be encouraging direct flights, because they are more environmentally sustainable. But actually, the emissions from flights are quite considerable, and we need to consider that if we are going to, as Patrick Harvey says, achieve our climate change ambitions. Now, as a member of the cross-party group on Pakistan, I support Hanzala Malik's ambition to get the direct flights to Lahore, and that's important because there's a big community here that need to have ease of access back to Pakistan. So there's an example of the things that we need to take, but to simply say that we need to cut in some cases down to zero, I think is wrong. So let's consider these things in the round, not in isolation. Let's consider it carefully, because it's not as straightforward as many members would like to think.
Thanks very much. I now call Gavin Brown. Around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think we've had a very useful debate in the Chamber today, with interesting and valid contributions from all parts of the Chamber. There have been areas of, I think, broad agreement, if not unanimous agreement, and also areas of broad disagreement. I think one of the broad areas of agreement, with one or two exceptions,
is that there have been enormous difficulties caused by the current APD regime. While there may be some dispute as to the level and size of those difficulties, I think it's clear enough to me anyway that there are difficulties caused by it. We have seen, as we've heard from many members, about the increases both in short and long-haul flights, and I think it is fair to say that APD level is high compared to previous levels, and also high compared to the rest of Europe. And while the numbers again may be disputed, I think there probably has been a loss of passengers. Even though we've seen overall increases, I think probably lost opportunities in terms of passengers and in terms of visitor spend, and I think there is a risk that this could happen towards 2016 as well, as outlined in the York Aviation paper. So it does, I think, to a degree hit businesses, hit tourism and hard-pressed families. And over the last couple of years, the voices, I think, have grown louder, more coherent and pulled together a bit more, culminating, I think, in the report put forward by York Aviation. The question then becomes one of what do we do in relation to this? And that's where I think there is probably less agreement in the Chamber than in fact that there are difficulties caused. Should it be devolved? Should it be cut? Should it be scrapped? Or what can we best do to help businesses in Scotland, to help tourism and families, taking everything, as Willie Rennie said, into the round? Because we have heard a number of demands put forward by the Scottish Government in relation to powers that they don't have at the present time. But I have to say there has been disappointment about their use of the powers that they actually do have. Alex Johnson touched on this point, as did Hanzala Malik. The Conservative and the Labour Party amendments touch on this as well. And this is the issue of the Air Route Development Fund. Sure, happy to give it.
Just as he was getting to try and reveal what the Tory position was, I wonder if you could just clarify if his position, the Conservative position, is that of its past leader, Annabel Goldie, who supported devolution under the Connolly Commission, its current leader, Ruth Davidson, who appears to support abolition, or perhaps its future leader, Alec Johnson. And can you explain what Alec Johnson's position actually is?
Gavin Brown.
I suppose I should thank the Minister for that intervention. I think the position of the party is pretty clear. Leader Ruth Davidson has gone directly to the highest levels of the UK Government to make the pitch on behalf of the tourism industry, on behalf of Scottish business and on behalf of families within Scotland, that it is, in the current circumstances, hurting Scotland. Now, that's a different route from what is sometimes called megaphone diplomacy. Sometimes that works equally effective too. But I think the taking of Route 1 by Ruth Davidson in relation to that point could turn out to be effective. Who knows what is going to happen in the autumn statement and beyond? I'm not qualified to make any guarantees in relation to that at all. But I think the approach of going directly is a useful and worthwhile one, and that I hope will be effected. Sure.
Mr. Ferguson.
I appreciate much of what Mr. Brown says and also the tone in which he says so. But can he just explain one thing for me? Do the Scottish Conservatives believe that, at the very least, there should be a freeze in APD?
Gavin Brown.
I think Alec Johnson put the case forward pretty well. Our objective is to see passengers paying as little as possible. We don't want to see passengers paying any more than they have to, but we do have to take cognizance of the realities facing the UK Government and the Treasury at the moment, because they will hear week in, week out demands not just from the SNP as a party, but from the Scottish Government as a whole. Let me just give you a couple of examples we've heard in the last few weeks. We have heard demands from the Scottish Government that fuel duty must not go up. We've heard demands from the Scottish Government that VAT in general should be reduced. We've heard demands that VAT should be reduced substantially for the entire hospitality industry. It should be reduced substantially for any building work, repairs and maintenance. We also want to see hugely increased capital spending for our shovel-ready projects. We also want to see higher pensions. We have a huge list from the Scottish Government in terms of areas where they want greater spending or reduced taxes But the reality, Deputy Presiding Officer, is that the UK Government has to balance the books. And the Scottish Government never say which of these are actually their priorities. It is a shopping list of items that they don't have to take responsibility for. I'm in my last minute. I won't be taking any more interventions for that reason. But what we haven't heard from the Scottish Government today is what they would actually do with APD were it to be devolved. Would they scrap it in its entirety, as was alluded to by Kenneth Gibson? Would they just reduce it, or would they increase it? Their track record on taxation for business was great with the small business bonus, but pitiful for the retail levy, even more pitiful for the son of the retail levy, even more pitiful in relation to empty rates. They have a very, very mixed track record in relation to that. And perhaps on my closing point, why don't they tell us why they haven't done more in relation to the Air Route Development Fund, a power they already have, show their intentions of genuinely doing something for Scottish business and industry, and then they will be taken more seriously in relation to powers they don't have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call Dr. Elaine Murray. 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate clearly is stimulated by the recent publication of the York Aviation Report on the impact of air passenger duty on Scotland, published at the end of last month. And like others, there have been some disagreement about the robustness of some of the figures in that. And I too have some doubts about the exact figures which are quoted in that report. However, some aspects of the report are clearly correct, and one of those is being that the UK is now out of step with much of the rest of Europe, and as a result, the parts of the economy which are reliant on air service access are being negatively impacted. Long-haul travel has been penalised in particular. Hanzala Malik gave us the example of the 8% increase between Glasgow and Lahore. Rates have increased by 225 to 360% on long haul since 2007. And unfortunately, that differential encourages short-haul flights to hubs elsewhere to connect with long-haul flights where APD may be lower or non-existent. And that actually has a negative impact on the reduction of carbon emissions, because those, as others have said, are proportionately greater for shorter flights. Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen rely on air services to connect with the finance and business sectors in the case of Edinburgh and Glasgow, and the energy sector in Aberdeen's case. And I was in the debate for the entire time, and I actually did hear a number of members talking about environmental considerations, including Hanzala Malik and Mary Fee and Helen Eadie and Stuart Stevenson, and indeed Kevin Stewart. And I think Kevin Stewart made a good example in the case where passengers may indeed go from short-haul flights to Northern Ireland in order to access long-haul flights elsewhere, and that will have a negative impact on carbon emissions because of the landing and taking off over short distances on short runways. And I think it was important that people made those comparisons. And we do have evidence that passengers are not flying. I mean, the idea that you could take a train from London to Aberdeen to perform your business there isn't realistic. People won't do that. They'll either fly and pay the extra duty, or else they may find somewhere else to do their business, which is less expensive. And that's the problem. They will still fly. And that is one of the problems. And as others said, in fact, the APD, the government, I think it was Brian Adams who said this, the UK government has more or less admitted that this tax is revenue-raising rather than carbon-reducing. It raises a lot of money. And as Helen Eadie pointed out to us, it's a very good tax in the sense it's an exported tax because people in other countries are paying a lot of it rather than people over here. That always makes it a slightly more popular tax for individuals if other people are paying it. And tourism can be, as many people said, will be affected, although obviously only on the one flight where tourists are coming into or leaving the UK. Some people are arguing possibly that higher flight charges might encourage UK residents to holiday at home, but actually it isn't just the cost of the flight, which people look at the cost of the holiday as well. But unfortunately, holidaying within the United Kingdom tends to be more expensive, and people are still encouraged to go elsewhere. And of course, APD was restructured in 2009 from 2 to 4 bands. It has 2 charges for each band, a full rate for passengers in the premium class and a reduced rate for the economy class. And we've seen a variety of different increases across those 4 bands since then. And I think actually that demonstrates there is actually the opportunity, if we devolve APD, for flexibility in the way in which it is applied. And I think that it does need to be further discussion as to how you would tackle the issue of APD. Richard Baker reminded us of the double whammy that exists where a passenger from a regional airport has to change planes at one of the London airports, and if there's a change of airline at that point, they will pay APD twice, and that is clearly an unfairness to passengers who are travelling from the regional airports. I think it was Colin Weir who mentioned initially that the APD levels were reduced in Northern Ireland about a year ago, and all long-haul flights now are taxed at Band A, and that has helped to retain the direct flight route to New York. And therefore, obviously, the power to change APD rates has actually benefited one part of the United Kingdom. And we believe not that we wanted to get every single taxpayer here, but we would like to have that sort of flexibility within Scotland to make those sorts of decisions. And indeed, the Silk Commission on Future Devolution in Wales, which was published yesterday, proposes that APD should be devolved to the Welsh Assembly for long-haul flights initially, but with future consideration of the devolution of all rates. Yes.
Mr. Keith Brown.
Can I thank Elaine Murray for giving way? Just to ask her the question on this issue about devolution of it. Is she supporting the position that we have, already having gone to one devolution commission, we have to do that again, and to have a further review by the UK government prior to having any devolution, or would she support devolution of this tax now?
We have actually established that case, I believe, for APD, but the importance of looking at devolution in the round is that we are undertaking a devolution commission which will look at all forms of taxation. I have other suggestions of other taxes which could be devolved to the Scottish Parliament, but they are not currently part of Labour policy, and that is what we are refining in advance of the independence revolution, referendum, in order to be able to present that alternative to people in Scotland. But I think we also have to be clear, both the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats are right about this, that we do need to look at the financial consequences, because if the York Aviation report is correct, there is something like the revenue from Scotland would be £433 million in 2016-17, and that would imply that it was currently raising about £322 million. Now, I don't know that is actually correct, but the Silk Commission is suggesting that in Wales there would be a fixed deduction to the block grant to be agreed between the Welsh and UK governments, and presumably a similar arrangement would be reached for devolution to the Scottish Government. And therefore, if we wish to reduce APD, or we want to make changes to APD, we do need to consider how that would be funded. We can't run away from that. And clearly, if there was such an arrangement with the UK Government, there would be an immediate reduction in the block grant, and we would have to look at that.
Minister Ferguson.
I'm very supportive of the thrust of her argument. Does she agree that if we had the power to reduce APD in Scotland, then we would have a competitive advantage, which would better enable us to win long-haul flights to places such as China?
Dr. Murray.
There is the argument that would eventually benefit the economy, but it's a bit like the arguments around your decreasing capital gains. Sorry, corporation tax. It's a bit like the argument around that if the money is taken off the block grant, you immediately have to find that money, that reduction, and therefore that has an immediate impact on public spending. And eventually you might get that money back if the economy grows, but you've got to make the reduction straight away, and that's what you have to face. That's a difficult issue, is how you have to face that. You wouldn't necessarily, you have to grow the economy first. You're not going to grow the economy in an instant. You would have to find the cuts to public services in an instant. Now, the other thing I think that we would probably dispute is the contention in the motion that the devolution of APD is the only solution. Richard Baker and others spoke about the lamented Route Development Fund, and others have spoken about other interventions such as marketing initiatives. Indeed, Hanzala Malik told us something about the Glasgow initiatives. I think actually that Mary Fee made a very important point about balance and the need that we would have to take a balanced approach, and that we do need to look at carbon emissions, we do need to look at how we manage the reduction in spending. And if we want to grow the economy. I think we do need to treat it with caution. And finally, can I say that Stuart Stevenson made a lot of very good suggestions, but I thought that concurred a lot with a part of our amendment on the need to work with airlines in order to reduce carbon emissions.
Thank you very much. I now call on Minister Keith Brown. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I say that I think it has been, as has been mentioned already, a fairly constructive debate with a lot of good ideas, obviously different points of view. Just to pick out some of the things which I took note of, Colin Kears, I think, very successfully put his finger on the actual issue here, which is about jobs. Very important issue, which is sometimes forgotten in some of the other discussions, but jobs absolutely central, and he was right to report back on what was an excellent cross-party group meeting, the inaugural meeting, where we had a very high level of representation. I thought Malcolm Chisholm, as ever, gave a thoughtful speech. I would say that he was right to say that the environmental benefits, alleged environmental benefits of this tax, are substantially overplayed. In fact, there are very few people, apart from perhaps Patrick Harvey, who would actually claim this to be an environmentally friendly tax at this stage. It's very much a tax grab by the... I will do, yes.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Like one of his backbench colleagues, the Minister has slightly misrepresented what I've said. What I've said in my amendment and in my speech is that the objective we should set when we look at financial measures and others in relation to aviation is to restrain relentless growth. Can he tell us how unending aviation growth is compatible with the climate change objectives?
Can I say that's not quite what Patrick Harvey said when he spoke? He did say that he saw the APD as a means of restricting further aviation growth. He also said, I would assume, what he didn't say though, was whether he would support further increases in APD, which is a logical next step of his particular case. He also did not address the point which has been made by a number of speakers, which was that this works against the environment in a number of ways, one of which is, to get what's happening now, and it's the industry that's telling us, people are going to Dublin and they're going to Schiphol to take long-haul flights that they could take from Scotland, and thereby increasing the harm to the environment. He never addressed that when he spoke. I think the other very key point that was made by Brian Adam, when he said, this has to happen now. That's the whole point of this. This has to happen now. I think the York Aviation Report, obviously people have different views on it, but it does point out the impact this is having on the economy now. And we're well past the stage of further commissions and further reviews. I think we have to see some action taken now. Mary Fee, I thought, also gave a thoughtful speech. I didn't agree with much of it, but I do think there was a lot of thought put into that. Annabel Ewing again made the point that there have been endless commissions, but no substantial action taken on this point. And I think, quite crucially, I think Kenny Gibson pointed up the confusion which there exists in Conservative ranks. We heard it first of all from Alec Johnson, didn't hear any further clarity, unfortunately, from Gavin Brown. And can I say to Hamzallah Malik, a point made, if I can just finish this last point, then I'll take an intervention from him. Hamzallah Malik made the point about action that can be taken just now, and I understand that point. I have spoken to Glasgow Chamber of Commerce, first of all, on what we can do to replace the Route Development Fund. They said they had suggestions, and like some of the comments that were made today, that this could be done if enough effort was applied to it. Now, I've taken that approach. Nobody has yet been able to say how we could replicate much of what that fund did. There are things that you can do, and you mentioned marketing, and we are doing that. That is happening just now, and we're doing further work with the European Commission shortly to make sure we can expand that as far as we can do it. So work is ongoing in relation to that. I don't know if Gavin Brown still wants to make an intervention.
I'm grateful for the Minister for giving way. He sought clarity. Were APD to be devolved swiftly, what would exactly the government do with APD? Would it scrap it? Would it cut it? Can he give us specific, detailed proposals on what the Scottish Government would actually do?
Keith Brown. I think what we have revealed is a fig leaf by which the Tories are behind in taking no action at all. The point is to devolve it first and let this Parliament decide. But the Parliament's got to take its own decisions. And as I said, of course, I accept the point which Willie Rennie also made. There's an opportunity cost. If you spend money on not raising APD, you have to find it from somewhere else. I accept that. But the basic point is this Parliament has to have that power in the first place. And you're using it as a fig leaf not to give us that power in the first place. Can I say, the Conservative position, I think, was very, very uncomfortable for them, but it was very unfortunate because I think there was a real chance at the outset of this debate to have a fairly united voice by the Parliament, which reflected that cross-party group which Colin Keir chaired, when the whole of the industry, people you could never normally get in the same room together, Ryanair, British Airways and EasyJet, all saying with one voice, action has to be taken on this. And I think the Tories have squandered that. We have had, I've had enough so far, and he wouldn't take any from our side, of course, as well, but as was frequently in most debates these days. But can I say that you have to agree, what is your position? Is it the Ruth Davidson position of APD should be scrapped? Is it Annabel Goldie's position, which was it should be devolved? Or what is the position? There is no clarity on the position, and I think it's being used. Or also, is it something to do with the fact that airways, unlike trains, will not allow you to sit in first class when you've only paid a second-class ticket? I'm not sure if that's the case there. But I think it was a chance for the Conservatives to support that. On the Liberal position, I have to say that accusing our motion of being timid, when there is no action proposed by the Liberal Democrats, where there is nothing to be said in support of their previous position of devolution, and by that I mean devolution now, not further excuses for not taking action, that is the essence of timidity, and it's a position that Willie Rennie adopted. And can I say that having somebody like Danny Alexander at the centre of the Treasury, we would really have expected a great deal more than earnest reasons for not taking any action at all from Liberal Democrats. Well, despite the fact he wouldn't take an Treasurer Neil, take one from him.
Just like Helen Eady, I apologise to the Minister as well for not letting him in. Does he actually support taking APD levels back to 2007, or will he stop complaining about the 2 million lost passengers?
Minister? Well, certainly I'm not going to stop complaining about lost passengers and the lost benefit to the Scottish economy. The point is, which our consistent position has been, is we believe it should be devolved. We've also made it fairly clear that we don't want these powers for the sake of it. We want these powers in order to improve the economic lot of people in Scotland. Perhaps they can deduce from that what we intend to do with APD. And just to come to the Labour position, there's a great deal which I welcome in some of the contributions from Labour members. I have to say that the unfortunate effect of the amendment which has been proposed by Richard Baker actually deletes the reference to devolving APD to Scotland. Despite some of the statements made by some of the members, it takes out that reference, does talk about a further devolution commission. We've had this commission already, and does talk about going back to the UK Government for the further review. Now, they've said twice, over a period of about 14 months, they're reviewing the position. First of all, they're reviewing the position in relation to Scotland. That was the first position of the coalition government. It's now their position. They're reviewing it in relation to the rest of the UK. And I will do in just a second. And just to remind people of the point that the Calman Commission, to which the three unionist parties subscribed, made the point that not only was APD being devolved to Scotland a good thing, it was especially necessary if it was devolved to Northern Ireland, which has now happened. I'll give way to Martin Chisholm.
Very briefly, I thank the Minister for giving way, but it seems to me as clear as day, because the motion says it believes that devolution of APD to Scotland should form part of and other measures taken by the UK Government, but it's absolutely clear.
Can I say it doesn't say that. It says immediate action to resolve the anomaly that was talked about through paying APD twice. What it does say is that it should be devolved, and that the Scotland Bill Committee found a strong case for devolving it, and that it should inform the work of the Devolution Commission, and further recognises, it goes on to say, there should be an immediate wider review of APD by the UK Government. How many reviews do we need in relation to this matter? And I've taken enough interventions already. How many reviews do we need in relation to this matter? Jobs are being lost just now. And it's worth saying as well, if you look at the actual figures, this was hinted at by one or two members, but if you look at the actual figures, the maximum in the UK, the maximum rate in any class, €226. The next highest, which is Germany, is €42. So we are more than 5 times the highest other European country to levy this tax. And of course the comparison was made as well with Ireland, often derided in this chamber by others. Ireland, compared to €226 in the UK, it's €3. Does anybody seriously believe that we are not bleeding business to Ireland with that kind of levy on top of the airfares? And for a family of 4 or 5 going to, say, Florida or somewhere on a family holiday, the impact of that is going to make people say, I'm not going to make that journey, I'll make another journey instead. Now, of course, if it results in a staycation, then we can get a benefit from that. But don't let's pretend that it's not having an impact on people saying, I'm not going to make this journey because of the punitive rates of this particular tax in Scotland. And of course, it's worse in Scotland than it is in other parts of the country for the reasons which a number of members have raised. And just to say, finally on this, I think the York Aviation report was, regrettably, I think, undermined to the extent that people try to pull threads at it. These are serious people involved in business. I've spoken to each, as Fergus Ewing has done as well, speaking to each of the airport managers. I've spoken to most of the airlines. Now, I don't deny, of course, there is an element of self-interest that comes from a particular point of view, but that self-interest of the airlines and the airports coincides with our interest, which is to increase the economic benefit to people of Scotland from the use of our airports. It's a serious report that's been commissioned. It's a serious case that's been made. They also said to us they could not get a hearing from the Treasury. They could not get a rational answer at the Treasury, despite all their efforts, and they were stunned by the appalling lack of access. They made many comments to it. In fact, there were one or two members, John Scott, who's in the chamber now, was at that meeting as well. There were mention made of the fact how much access and support they've had, not just from the Scottish Government, but other people from other parties should be willing to make that support. There is a chance for us to unite around this and to achieve a positive difference for the people of Scotland. I'm very pleased that Richard Baker has said that, despite the fact I feel unable to accept his amendment for the reasons mentioned, that the Labour Group, I think, will support the motion. I would urge others to do the same, and that way we can speak with a united voice, which would be very important. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Minister. We now move on to the next item of business. And the next item of business is consideration of two motions, number 4830 and number 4832, in the name of Dave Thompson. 4830 is on Public Bodies Act Order Standing Order rule changes, and 4832 is Dave Thompson, the consultation on the Code of Practice for Ministerial Appointments to Public Bodies. Mr Thompson, I would appreciate it if you would talk to and move both of the motions, and I can give you until 5 o'clock to do so.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. The Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee is recommending standing order changes which will establish a procedure for Parliament to consent to orders under the UK Public Bodies Act 2011, which affect devolved interests. The Public Bodies Act gives UK ministers the authority to abolish, merge or transfer the functions of certain public bodies. The Act is largely enabling legislation, with any changes to public bodies taking place via secondary legislation, with orders being brought forward at Westminster. However, any orders which are within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament require to be consented to by this Parliament. Interim arrangements have been in place since last year, and the procedure used has been based on that for current legislative consent motions. Firstly, the Scottish Government lays a memorandum which gives its views on the order, with that memorandum being accompanied by a copy of the order, plus the relevant accompanying documents. Secondly, a lead committee and the Subordinate Legislation Committee considers the memorandum and reports to the Parliament. And finally, the Parliament has to debate an LCM-style motion and vote on whether to give its consent to the order. Over the past year, the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee has taken the opportunity to consider how well these interim arrangements have worked in practice, and we have concluded that these arrangements have provided an effective model for scrutiny of the orders. In each case, the relevant subject committee and the Subordinate Legislation Committee have scrutinised the order and reported to the Parliament. Parliament has then taken a decision on whether to consent to the order, which has been informed by this scrutiny. We are therefore proposing that these arrangements should form the basis of new standing orders. The main change being proposed by the committee is a new chapter of standing orders, Chapter 9BA, covering the procedure for consenting to Public Bodies Act orders. This largely mirrors the legislative consent motion procedure set out in Chapter 9B, with appropriate modifications. The remit of the Subordinate Legislation Committee in Rule 611 is also being amended to allow it to consider the orders. In addition, there are several consequential changes resulting from the new procedure, including changes to Rule 5.4 on the Business Programme and Rule 5.9 on the Business Bulletin. The motion in my name invites Parliament to note the Committee's report and agree that the changes to standing orders are made with effect from the 21st of November 2012. and I move that motion in my name. Presiding Officer, I will move on to deal with the Public Appointments Commissioner consultation. The Commissioner issued a consultation on the 30th of August 2012 on revisions to the Code of Practice for Ministerial Appointments to Public Bodies in Scotland. The purpose of the Code of Practice is to provide the framework that enables Scottish ministers to attract and appoint the most able people in a manner that meets the requirements of the Public Appointments and Public Bodies, etc. Scotland Act 2003. The consultation aims to establish if there is scope to make improvements to the Code itself or to the guidance issued by the Public Appointments Commissioner. The current Code of Practice was made in April 2011 and only came into effect in September 2011. The Public Appointments Commissioner's reasons for reviewing the Code just 1 year on are, firstly...
Excuse me, Mr Thompson. There's just far too much chattering in the chamber. If you could just please have the courtesy to listen to Mr Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, to ensure the Code is operating on the basis of effectiveness, efficiency and economy. Secondly, to ensure that regulation under the Code is proportionate. And finally, to act as a real aid to ministers to ensure appointments are made openly, fairly and with due regard to equal opportunity requirements. A number of issues were raised during our committee evidence with the Commissioner, including feedback received on the operation of the current Code, the format of application forms, the variations in length of recruitment exercises, the effectiveness of the current reappointment process and the role of the public appointments assessors. The Commissioner has indicated that he is likely to bring forward specific proposed revisions to the Code of Practice early in 2013, and in the light of that, the Committee has agreed simply to note the current consultation meantime. The motion in my name, therefore, invites Parliament to note the Committee's report on the consultation on the Code of Practice for Ministerial Appointments to Public Bodies in Scotland, and I move that motion.
The question on both these motions. A well-deserved round of applause. The question on both these motions will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 4879 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on causal membership for the Committee of Regions. I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move the motion.
Formally moved.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time. There are 8 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 4874.3 in the name of Richard Baker, which seeks to amend motion number 4874 in the name of Keith Brown on air passenger duty be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 4874.3 in the name of Richard Baker is as follows. Yes, 31. No, 69. There were 13 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 4874.2 in the name of Alex Johnson, which seeks to amend motion number 4874 in the name of Keith Brown on air passenger duty be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 4874.2 in the name of Alex Johnson is as follows. Yes, 13. No, 100. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I would wish to remind members that in relation to the debate on air passenger duty, if the amendment in the name of Willie Rennie is agreed, the amendment in the name of Patrick Harvie falls. Therefore, the next question is amendment number 4874.4 in the name of Willie Rennie, which seeks to amend motion number 4874 in the name of Keith Brown on air passenger duty be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 4874.4 in the name of Willie Rennie is as follows. Yes, 4. No, 96. There were 13 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 4874.1 in the name of Patrick Harvie, which seeks to amend motion number 4874 in the name of Keith Brown on air passenger duty be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 4874.1 in the name of Patrick Harvie is as follows. Yes, 2. No, 110. There was 1 abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question then is that motion number 4874 in the name of Keith Brown on air passenger duty be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 4874 in the name of Keith Brown is as follows. Yes, 93. No, 19. There was 1 abstention. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4830 in the name of Dave Thompson on Public Bodies Act Standing Order Rule changes be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4832 in the name of Dave Thompson on consultation on the Code of Practice for ministerial appointments to public bodies in Scotland be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4879 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on COSLA membership for the Committee of the Regions be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.